All right. Hello? Okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Zittrain. I'm pleased to call this meeting of the Open Internet Advisory Committee to order and to welcome all of the committee members who traveled from near and less near to be here today. This is our annual bookend. We began as a committee roughly 1 year ago in this room. Since then, there have been a lot of words spoken and exchanged, a lot of drafts exchanged, and we have a chance today to think about our work that has gone so far, I think, which is overall just fantastic. It's amazing to be walking down memory lane and reading our draft reports, and my hope is by the end of our convening today, we'll have sufficient consensus to be able to fully release this report, primarily with what the working groups have done, to the general public. And I'm also hoping today to have a chance to talk among ourselves and then with public input and participation about our work for the coming year. And that includes both the substance of what we're doing and the process. Process-wise, in the past year, we have done a bit of a tour of the country. We started out in D.C. and then moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, hosted by Harvard University. The Bay Area, hosted by Stanford. We had another meeting in Chicago, hosted by Northwestern, and then we're back in D.C., hosted by the FCC, which I note has very good bandwidth, but some ports are blocked, so somebody should be looking into that from an open internet perspective.
They do it on purpose.
They do it on purpose, says David. I thought it would be good, though, just to refamiliarize ourselves and for those who are in the gallery and might be new to this, to simply do a round of introductions around the table again, and then what we'll do is move to brief précis from our 4 working group chairs on the work of their working group over the course of the year, anything that they or then their working group members might want to say about the final product that's in our draft. And then we will be able to shift to an open discussion among us around the committee's work for next year. So why don't we start with our introductions, give Harvey just a little more time to turn up. So let's start with Marcus.
Hi, I'm Marcus Walden. I'm the CTO for Alcatel-Lucent, a company that makes networking equipment, both wireless and wireline. If you're a DSL subscriber or a fiber-to-the-home subscriber or wireless subscriber in North America, you are probably running over our equipment.
Great.
I'm Charles Slocum, representing the Writers Guild of America and content creators generally.
My name is Chip Sharp. I'm with Cisco Systems and the Research and Advanced Development Group, working on tech policy and internet governance. Thank you.
I'm Dennis Roberson from Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'm representing T-Mobile.
And I'm Kevin McIlerney. I'm responsible for network engineering at Comcast.
Jen Rexford from Princeton. I'm a professor in the computer science department and a member of the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton.
Matt Larson, I'm the CEO of VistaBeam, representing the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. We're a fixed wireless broadband providers across the U.S.
Tejas Naracheni, the Special Counsel at the FCC and the Designated Federal Officer for this committee.
Jonathan Zittrain. I'm a professor of law and of computer science at Harvard and a co-founder of its Berkman Center for Internet and Society.
I'm David Clark. I'm a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory.
Chuck Kalmanek, a former head of research at AT&T, representing AT&T.
Russ Housley from Vigil Security. I'm representing the Internet Standards community.
Shane Greenstein. I'm a professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University.
I'm Maurice Dean, Director of Product Management for Netflix at OpenConnect.
I'm Alyssa Cooper. I'm the Chief Computer Scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, an Internet Policy Organization.
And I guess Harvey didn't make it. I'm Brad Burnham, and I represent Union Square Ventures. We're an investor in the applications layer of the web, so the services that run on top of the infrastructure we talk about today.
Wonderful. All right. Harvey has not made it, but we'll keep an eye out for him. And for a special introduction suggested by Dennis, Henning Schulz-Rinne, the Chief Technical Officer of the Federal Communications Commission, taking Harvey's chair, but not representing specifically Mozilla. So anything else you want to say, Henning?
All right, thank you. Sorry for being late.
No worries at all. All right, with that said, why don't we turn to the respective briefings from the working group chairs, and it's worth noting for the record and to the public that 99.8% of the work of this committee has been occasioned through its working groups. So this is a chance to hear the substance of what the committee has been doing, and when we hit our plenary discussion after these reports and discussions, we'll have a chance to think about reconfiguring, adding, subtracting, changing the remit of and composition of each of these working groups. So why don't we start with Shane from Economic Impacts, and I understand you may have some slidage to show.
Hey, Jonathan, before we jump in, should we check to see if anyone's on the phone?
And there's people on the phone. Oh, who should introduce themselves. Good point. So people on the phone, in whatever order you can muster, since you can't coordinate with one another, I think we're going to be able to up the volume. Just try again. We didn't hear the first mumblings.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Hi, it's
This
Michelle
sponsored by
Zatlin. I'm
Verizon.
the co-founder of Cloudflare. We're a performance, security, and availability service, and I'm currently in San Francisco.
And can you say the name again, just for the record?
Oh, Michelle Zatlin.
Michelle Zatlin. Welcome again, Michelle.
Thank you.
Anyone else on the phone dial-in? All right. Very good. Over to Shane.
Okay. Well, my goal here is just to give a 5-minute overview of the work of the working group on economic impacts. We spent our year summarized by this document, policy issues and data caps and usage-based pricing. And let's see if that works. Yes, it does. So the report has considerable substance in it, and I'm just going to say from the to start out, 5 minutes isn't going to do it justice, but our point here is just to take 5 minutes. This is the outline of what's covered, and you can see I just can't possibly cover that in 5 minutes, but that's to intrigue you to read it. Okay, so there we go. So the report itself addresses the question, what's the source of concern with data caps and wireline non-specialized services? The report tries to provide definitions and identify concerns, identify a common fact basis, and identify open questions. And as I've said when we first talked about this in the spring, the thing I find I'm most proud of, and I learned quite a bit from, is to try to bridge the divide between the vernacular conversation and the actual discussion of various stakeholders. Just to remind everybody, the order did have some comments on usage-based pricing, but does not actually directly talk about caps, except in the context of the talking about usage-based pricing, and that's where it's implied. And it says quite a bit. I won't read it for you at this moment, but it left open questions, and it was clear the order expected the internet to evolve. It's in the sort of open-ended spirit of that we were examining caps. So first of all, to say one of the first things we did was just to try to gather facts, and just to give you a brief overview of some of the conclusions. The report concludes there's considerable variance and experimentation in the market by ISPs. It's actually rather challenging and difficult to interpret the highest thresholds in the situations in which they arise, and there's really no definitive public source on household usage per month to use as a benchmark. Usage varies quite a bit across households and across ISPs and technology, and the one commonality across all public measurement is the great skew in usage. And generally, most of the caps we've observed in the United States don't yet impact users other than the highest users. And so we can only reach tentative conclusions that the situation may change in the future as many of the conditions change, like user habits, supplier experimentation, vendor policy, and applications. We then looked at the three major stakeholders, users, ISPs, and edge providers. And again, just quick overview. The section on users particularly focused on user perceptions, talked a great deal about consumer education of user perceptions of caps and thresholds. It's really not yet apparent how much of the topic is transitory and how much is permanent. And we talked a great deal also about ISPs providing customers with tools to monitor or control data usage and the potential value of that. We can conclude that it requires further monitoring, and it's certainly not settled at this point. Next, we talked about perception of ISPs, and again, just to review, there's quite a number of divergent perspectives and open questions about whether data caps, tiers, and related forms of usage-based pricing what effects they have, and so just to summarize, whether they encourage end user encourage end users nearing the cap to act efficiently, whether they spur efficiency and innovation in the delivery of services, whether they help manage network growth, whether they encourage heavy users to change their usage, and if so, in what way, and whether they shape the future and conduct of other service providers, particularly application developers. And the report identifies a number of open questions, and again, I encourage you to read it if that's of interest. Finally, we then reviewed the perception of edge providers. We again discussed how caps, tiers, and usage-based pricing can shape other providers in the broadband ecosystem. In particular, we mean entrepreneurs who provide applications, build web pages, and operate other services in the cloud. This section of the report highlights that ISPs and edge providers have different perspectives on many open questions. We did also examine competition policy for specialized services in the section, though recognizing that this topic is covered by other working groups, and so many aspects of the specialized services is for the specialized service group. Competition policy, just to remind everyone, is concerned with situations where one firm, such as a broadband provider, supplies a service and also controls aspects affiliated with cost, performance, and user experience in a competing service provided by an edge provider. And we tried to identify some of the divergent perspectives between ISPs and edge providers about issues in competition policy. We did not find any easy answers in general, and again, concluded it requires further monitoring. And this, again, if you're interested, there's really a lot more detail in the report. So just want to conclude. There's a lot of substance. I have to say it was very, very interesting for me personally. I learned a great deal going through this. The report itself contains many perspectives as well as many open questions, and took a considerable amount of work by the committee members to write. It's definitely a group exercise, and we really encourage everyone to read the report in its entirety. And we've really accomplished something that is not in the public conversation, which is to put everything in one place.
Thank you, Shane. Mm-hmm. Are there additional views from that working group or questions to the working group on what Shane just said or on the report that is in our materials? Maybe, Shane, I can ask you a question that anticipates what might come up when we have our full discussion on what lies ahead. When you say merits further monitoring, I know that there are elements of the Open Internet Order that charge the committee with thinking about or engaging in some form of monitoring. Do you have any sense from your work with your working group on how that might be done, if it's a sensible thing to try to do, what that would look like?
Actually, we even raised the question in the report, too, because there are a number of open questions, and they're almost by definition can't be resolved today because they depend on things that will happen in the future. For example, the rate of growth in data use, which there are a variety of perspectives about.
Yes.
And there's a variety out there. Not all households are alike. So almost by definition, you have to monitor or watch just to understand which way it's going.
And I know even the exercise of putting into one table the respective policies, say on data caps from American ISPs, wireline, wireless, Canadian ISPs, because there was an example from Canada. Yeah. I think one member of your working group went to some lengths to visit around and figure it out. I don't know if that's something that would be worth.
And one would expect the firms to change as market conditions change. So we also wouldn't expect that to stay the same over time.
Got it.
Yeah, it was some work. Although I have to say that table, now that we know how to do it, right? The first time's always the hardest. Once you see how to do it, it's a little easier the second time around. Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, I sense, if not outright contentment around the table, I sense an absence of a wellspring of further questions or comments. So with that, turn to Jennifer Rexford to speak about mobile.
Great. So can people hear me? Okay. The Mobile Broadband Group, and I think my slide should be coming up on the screen shortly, looked at two different topics. In the fall, we looked at a very specific case study of AT&T and FaceTime, which was in the news right as our group was being formed. And in the spring, we focused more on a broader analysis of the mobile broadband ecosystem and the players involved. And those will come up in a moment. So basically, those are quite different in scope. One very focused, the other much more general, and one focused very specifically on the terms of the Open Internet Order, and the other much more focused on the broader goal of having innovation in the mobile broadband space. And I'll give you a brief overview of both of those. So just for folks that don't recall, back in last summer, Apple announced that its FaceTime high-quality video chat service would be available over cellular provider policies notwithstanding, and they started offering that in June of last year. And AT&T responded by restricting the use of Apple FaceTime over its cellular network to its mobile share customers that have a shared usage across a number of consumers in the home. And there are claims from the press and from advocates that AT&T was violating the Open Internet Order. AT&T said they weren't because they were being transparent about their policies and they didn't have a competing video chat application. Over a period of time, AT&T gradually relaxed the restrictions as part of what they called the staged deployment of the application over their network. And by the end of the year, it's unlimited use of that application across different service plans. So our group looked at a bunch of different issues in the context of this particular application. One was whether a preloaded application is different than an application a user has to download. So the FaceTime application is integrated into the normal calling features of the phone, and in that sense immediately available to all users that had that version of iOS. A second issue we talked about was the high bandwidth requirements of FaceTime, because it's a symmetric application that sends traffic in both directions, video traffic in both directions, and the application was not as adaptive in the face of congestion as other applications like Skype. A third issue we talked about was an issue AT&T raised about a desire to have a staged deployment of this application to make sure they could understand whether and how it might cause focused overloads on their network, rather than letting all users use it at once and have a risk of that overload. And finally, if it matters or not, where blocking of an application is enforced. In this case, it was enforced on the phone itself and not inside the network. And so it's a question of, whether the point of enforcement matters in terms of interpretation of the Open Internet Order or not. In the end, our group kind of synthesized all these issues and didn't come to a single conclusion, but we came with sort of three different conclusions from three different perspectives. Sort of reasonable people might disagree, but we all sort of thought these three opinions were in their own reasonable. From a perspective of application developers, that blocking lawful applications chills innovation, and that it would be better to manage congestion directly through appropriate pricing, rate limits, caps, usage-based pricing, or even dynamic pricing, rather than through the selective blocking of applications. From a carrier perspective, we looked at the fact that AT&T, unlike most other carriers, have a very large number of iPhone customers on grandfathered unlimited data plans, and so much more of a need to have a staged deployment of the application to prevent an overload. And that, in fact, this application was designed by Apple such that carriers could manage the application by telling Apple whether the application should be allowed on its 3G network for particular plans or not. And finally, from the equipment vendor perspective, that pre-installed applications that use a large amount of bandwidth and use it quite aggressively are something very challenging to manage, and that even though there might be other better traffic management approaches in the future, the available ones that exist now are ones that would be very difficult to use without harming the user experience, perhaps more so, by either having everybody have bad performance, for example. And then so that was the FaceTime case study that we released in January. Then we decided to take a step back and look a little more broadly at the players in the mobile broadband ecosystem and how they each collectively affect openness. And so at a high level, you expect that there's a pretty virtuous cycle here, that the building of mobile networks enables mobile devices to be built, that encourages application developers to develop cool apps, users to adopt those devices and apps, send traffic over those networks, and encourage their further growth. And to some extent that's true, but there are complex interrelationships between a lot of parties here: apps, the operating system developers, the device manufacturers, the carriers, and the network equipment vendors. And in fact, in many of these spaces, we have a small number of main players: Apple, Samsung, and LG in the smartphone space, for instance, Google and Apple in the OS space. And in some cases, the same party that's a major player in multiple of these spaces, as is the case with, say, Apple or Google or Samsung. We looked at the relationships that each of these parties have on one another, and we looked in more detail at 4 case studies to understand these in more detail. We looked at app stores to better understand the relationship between OS developers and application developers, and the way that application developers are affected by the screening policies of the app stores, by the 20 to 30% revenue sharing they need to do, and by their reliance on the app store for the promotion of their apps. And then we also looked at the longer-term trend that HTML5 could upend this space by making it possible to support applications without going through the App Store. We looked also at the agreements that carriers have with their customers, and particular things like locking of devices to work only with a particular carrier, restrictions on the use of tethering, and particular restrictions like the FaceTime example on the use of particular applications, and looked at longer-term trends, particularly in Europe and Asia, towards supporting two-sided pricing. Some carriers in the EU and in Asia support use of Spotify or Facebook in conjunction with those content providers in a way that doesn't count against the user's usage cap. And so we talked some about how that trend might change the relationship between carriers and their customers. We looked at the impact of application developers on the network, in particular application developers out of naivete or in some cases perhaps laziness, writing applications that are unduly chatty or consuming signaling resources on the network, unfair in the way they share bandwidth with other apps, or generally inefficient in sending a lot of duplicate data over a relatively limited resource. And this is one case, at least, where the tensions are actually working together, where educating app developers to write more network-friendly apps helps the app developer, helps the user, and helps the network. So this is mainly an area where education is useful. And finally, we looked at the area of Wi-Fi offloading in terms of offering a low-cost alternative for cellular broadband. And with the note that, of course, today there's variable performance, security, and mobility support, but that can change over time. And so this both will enable greater competition and user choice, and arguably already is, but also raises interesting questions about what it means if a Wi-Fi provider becomes a commercial carrier over an unlicensed spectrum that is a direct competitor with the cellular providers, and what relationship that might have to the purview of the Open Internet Order. So finally, just to conclude that part of our study, we just advocated that the FCC should take a fairly broad view of the interaction of all the parties, not just carriers, even though some of these parties aren't subject to the Open Internet Order, since these other parties have a pretty strong effect on both the way carriers behave and the incentives to innovate in this space, and to track particular developments that might be improving or competition or in some cases not. So HTML5, Wi-Fi offloading, and two-sided pricing being just 3 examples of emerging trends that might be worth keeping an eye on. And that in general, to have greater healthiness in the mobile broadband ecosystem, that it's useful to have greater transparency both for app developers and users, greater education for both app developers and users, and also increased competition both within and between different parts of the landscape here.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Are there additional comments from working group members or questions from anyone on this topic? Marcus?
Yeah, I'll add, it's slightly a personal perspective. Jen's summary, as always, was excellent. I think there was a portion of the working group who came to realize that operator power is diminishing in the ecosystem, not to say that there isn't a position of power there, but in fact the ecosystem is sufficiently nascent and evolving, and there are stronger forces in the ecosystem than the network operator. I think was at least something that I concluded by being a participant in that group. I don't know if others agree. Again, that's not to say there is no power in that segment, but it was a diminishing power relative to maybe 5 years ago.
Uh-huh. Maybe one question for you, Jennifer, and it's really, I guess, more in your individual capacity than as the working group chair, which is on the mobile ecosystem mapping exercise, which really was fascinating. Did you come away with a sense that if left to its own devices with the Newtonian momentum of that ecosystem going, if you crank the simulation forward several beats, does it end up in a place, and I guess this calls for a value judgment, that seems healthy, or for some of the suggestions you were talking about, which might well require a form of coordination or something about a means for an app developer to be aware of particular forms of congestion limiting or pricing? In other words, I'm asking, is this something where very interesting and let's watch the simulation continue, or do you see hints of a call for a coordination policy, some form of self-conscious intervention?
I think it's hard to crank the simulation forward because there have been some fairly abrupt events. I mean, the idea that BlackBerry wouldn't be on that slide at all, for example, a few years ago would have been pretty unthinkable. The fact that Google Android would dominate the OS market over Apple would probably have been unthinkable even 3 years ago. The emergence of HTML5, it's still in its early stages, but that could be quite disruptive. So I think we're seeing a bunch of individual disruptions, some of which make a pretty big change in the ecosystems. I find it personally very hard to crank the simulation forward.
Uh-huh.
And I think in some cases the incentives are aligned around, for example, the educating app developers, although I'd note that there are tens or even hundreds of thousands of app developers, so it's very challenging to educate them, but at least there the incentives are aligned. And in some of the other spaces it's a lot less obvious if the incentives are so well aligned.
Which brings us around, I guess, again to the monitoring question, or
Definitely.
how much this ecosystem would yield a cry for help if such a thing came
Yeah,
about.
I think that's quite fair, and I think right now the traffic management policies that carriers have are not documented in a form that's technically detailed enough necessarily to do that, which may itself be an issue worth taking up.
Got it. Kevin?
Jeffrey, you talked about kind of the application efficiency element, and I think from a developer standpoint, what is their incentives to be efficient in the development? And at the same and the counterpoint is, when you have a user, how do they know when the application isn't being efficient, working while they don't expect it to be working, and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. We spent a bit of time talking about that. I mean, certainly in the app stores, you increasingly see comments on how effective something is in terms of battery lifetime. And as more users have usage caps or usage-based pricing of some sort, there's more comments in the app store about how bandwidth efficient an application is. So I think over time there are incentives. More wonky things like signaling load are probably not going to be something you'd see in the app store. But I do think that because some of the same things that affect the network affect battery lifetime, I think you do at least see some progress in that space. And probably there's a greater need for tools that make it more visible to a user that the reason they're coming up against their usage cap is because this one app has been a bandwidth hog. And I think right now those applications aren't fully there, but over time greater visibility to users will make app developers have an incentive to tighten up their applications, otherwise users will shun them. I'd be curious if others have more thoughts on that.
Brad?
That Jen, when in the introduction, when you talked about the first review of the FaceTime app, you concluded with three different perspectives, and clearly I'm coming from the perspective of the applications developers, and I think that the thing that we might be underestimating here is how valuable pricing the actual underlying load of the network is. And so, I recognize that consumers and consumer advocates like an unlimited data plan, but in order to align the incentives of the application developers, the users, and the carriers, usage-based pricing and even peak load pricing would do that very nicely in a way that would allow the market to evolve such that there is going to be healthy investment in the network and healthy investment on the network. The minute you move away from that, you require some kind of intervention into the market to oversee the choices that carriers make. So if you offer an unlimited data plan and then you allow carriers to essentially selectively decide who gets to run on the network when, how often, what resources they get, then somebody has to decide, are they making the right choices? And so I think we are undervaluing the importance of a pricing mechanism that could allow the market to operate in a very healthy way, regardless of how it evolves going forward, and without having to know what the impact of HTML5 is, for instance, or the change in the market structure that Marcus mentioned.
Oh, sorry, Henning?
I think just because you mentioned pricing, I think it was a lot of healthy discussion in the working group of some of the difficulty of making that alignment happen, particularly because you tend to have multiple dimensions. You tend to have not just plain bytes per whatever, but signaling traffic being of different import, even though by volume it is very low. Do you price that now on a byte of signaling traffic separately? And then there's also the time of day dependence, that if you do congestion pricing, like has found favor, or maybe in some cases not so much in road traffic, that probably would send more precise signals to users and app developers, but it gets increasingly complicated for users and app developers to understand the consequences, and obviously the potential for surprises increases with that, so that if you suddenly find yourself that during peak hours your megabyte of data costs you, let's say your gigabyte of data costs you $1,000, it sends a very nice congestion signal, probably doesn't make for the happiest consumer.
So Henning's of course right that there is a trade-off to be made here, but I would argue that there is nothing complex about usage-based pricing, and in fact all of us who are of a certain age remember that it was cheaper to call after 11 o'clock at night on the telephone than it was before 11 o'clock at night. And that model is kind of ingrained in our heads with telephony and with electricity. And I think that's a fairly simple model for consumers to absorb. I think it's actually significantly simpler than any of the pricing schemes that the wireless carriers offer today. And I think there's a lot of evidence based on user surveys and that current complexity is quite baffling to users. So I recognize that it requires some education on the part of consumers, but I believe that given the choice of potentially chilling innovation or beginning to make consumers aware of the actual underlying resource utilization that they and their applications are consuming, it makes sense. I do think it also can apply to signaling resource. I mean, yes, it's wonky, but if it's priced in a way that actually reflects the underlying use of the network, people will, I think, understand it fairly quickly.
So Brad, I think if we're going to talk about the label proposal, I think, and we were talking about that a little earlier, the issue we have in mobile networks is the word mobile, which means that the goodness of the network changes instantaneously depending on the load on a given cell, your distance from that cell, the amount of spectrum available in that cell, the number of sectors deployed, et cetera, the availability of Wi-Fi So it's essentially, to go to the label discussion, it's as if your nutrition label, which we all agree we've come to understand and could be a way that you educate users as to what's good and not. So you have to change that label at every point in time in order for the user to actually understand what the pricing will be based on the current usage of the current resource, and then average that over a month. So although your scheme, I think, is I like the simplicity, I think inherently in mobile, it's not that easy to make a meaningful comparison. It's as if you change the nutrition label every 5 minutes in terms of what's good for you and what's not. And so I think that adds complexity to that particular model, which allows for making a more nuanced judgment than just bits per second on average over a month.
So this is one of the things that I thought was really useful that came out of our whole discussion around the signaling is that right now there's no dial set on the signaling resource, right? And so the really tough question is whether you can set the dial just enough so that it alters application behavior, but ultimately doesn't really, you don't want the consumer's bill based on the signaling resource to be changing wildly all the time. And so the interesting question to me is whether there's a place that you can get it to such that most of the problematic application behaviors go away, but consumers generally don't have to be tuned into, which radio access network are they connected to right now and which application they're using. So to me, that's like a really interesting, fruitful question for the future is, can you balance those two things and make it simple for consumers who have less time to spend figuring this stuff out, but maybe a little more complicated for application developers who, in theory, have more resources to put into that, solving that problem.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. That's a perfect place where operating system developers could help out, because it'd be nice to have a point to arbitrate amongst the applications of a single user, in addition to being able to share resources fairly amongst applications from different users. And so if the OS were more aware of the constrained resource and able to schedule, then it would push back to certain applications on the phone just not getting the resources because they've been bandwidth hogs or signaling hogs in the past.
Well, looking forward to the coming year, it's interesting that because of the stakeholder composition of the committee, there's opportunity when one idea is floated for someone from a particular affected stakeholder to say, well, here's why that would work or wouldn't work, or here are the issues with that. It's been very clarifying. Because the committee is not 50 people rather than 20-some, we don't have an OS maker that I know of. Is there a hidden OS maker? I don't know if Mozilla, I was looking at Harvey as potentially.
That actually was one of the requirements that we were looking at in our operating system that we actually built into the Firefox, the version 1.1 that's coming out later on this summer. But that was one of the pieces that we heard from carriers about that exact signaling issue.
So it also makes me wonder, just to place a marker for the future, if in our future meetings it could be useful to schedule time to hear, say, from various OS makers or for others as ideas are getting developed and kicked around here, to reach out to those communities, especially if we might end up with some recommendations or requests of those communities.
Yeah, I think that would help in two ways. One is the obvious thing you just mentioned about the operating system, but since that's also tied with the App Store in many cases too, I think that was an area where we felt we would have benefited from some extra feedback and input.
Yeah. Good. So that's a good note to ourselves, that as working groups think there might be other voices to be heard from or people to be talking to think about how to make use of our full committee meeting for those purposes. Great. Anything else on mobile or the report, Chuck?
Just one or two other points that I thought I would bring up that came up over the course of the last year of discussion in the mobile broadband working group. I think similar to the point that Marcus made, I think all of us in some sense learned a lot about the complexity of the ecosystem and the dynamism of the ecosystem. I actually recall a number of years ago reading articles about before Wi-Fi was widely incorporated in all of the devices that we carry around, people were speculating that carriers would not want Wi-Fi to be used in these devices and would try to block the emergence of Wi-Fi in devices. And of course, it's exactly the opposite of that. It is viral growth. We recognize in the report the importance of multiple technologies being able to provide wireless connectivity, and we've seen the proliferation of use of Wi-Fi technology. So that people can, when they're in an area where they can use, where they can offload their traffic, they do so. App stores, which Jennifer just mentioned, again, a number of years ago, I don't think any of us would have predicted the role that app stores would have in encouraging or controlling, as it were, the kinds of applications that people would have access to, and the incredible power that the app store providers actually have over what people can and can't do with their devices. So the dynamism of the ecosystem, and also it didn't come up here, but it's also, I think, important to recognize that the mobile broadband ecosystem is a global ecosystem. All of the standards that carriers are implementing, that our vendors are implementing, are driven by international standards, and so that external, as it were, influence is also important, I think, to recognize and acknowledge, because none of this ecosystem can move forward independent of what's going on in the rest of the world.
Thank you. David, you've got that look.
No, I have to speak once everybody else is done.
That's true. You're getting ready. It's a preemptive look. Yep.
Just a quick comment on this. I think one of the things I want to echo something that Marcus said that talked about the shift away from carrier focus, that we're starting to see a little bit more control in the hands of the users and the actual device makers. People are developing more of a relationship with their phone than they are necessarily with their network. And then also to emphasize the importance of Wi-Fi offload. As people continue to use more data, Wi-Fi offload has started to take on an increasing load on the network, and it kind of focuses on the need for more unlicensed spectrum out there for both small cells and for individual user and enterprise deployment to take some of that load off of heavily loaded mobile networks.
And I guess it also reminds me of something that came up in the mobile working group and talking about this stuff, that as there is more offloading taking place to a consumer, it's really hard to know where your broadband is coming from, and what might feel like mobile to a cell is suddenly mobile to a Wi-Fi access point, which will have a whole different set of restrictions, including, say, the signaling congestion could change between the two. Whether or how the consumer should be alerted to that, I know came up in the group as a real question. Anything else on mobile, or should we move to specialized services? Let's move to specialized services and over to David Clark.
Okay. The term specialized services is used in the I don't have slides, sorry. I'm growing weary of PowerPoint. We were asked to advise the FCC on specialized services. In fact, I believe that is one of the obligations that's specifically called out in the report and order. The committee took its task as having two parts. The first one was to see if we could define carefully what was meant by the term specialized services, and I'll come back to that in a second. And the second was to develop advice to the FCC as to how they should monitor specialized services with respect to their impact on broadband internet access. The definition of specialized services is slightly more complicated than it might seem, because the definition in the report and order is in some respects not entirely clear, and the FCC has used alternative definitions of different documents. And one of the things we realized in talking to ourselves was that we were using different definitions, and it made it very hard for us to have a forward ongoing conversation. In general terms, specialized services is that term to describe things that can be offered over the facilities of a facilities provider, a cable or a telephone company, which are distinct from the internet service and therefore do not fall under the report and order. But the question is, where is that line drawn, and precisely how is that definition written? So I would urge you, if you're interested in this, to go look at the actual text of our report. It's only 6 pages, and we call out there some of the specific definitions that the FCC's used, and try to point out what some of the variations are in the definition. We don't propose a specific definition. We point out that the FCC should probably attend to this, because it could conceivably lead to some confusion going forward. But obviously the question that's of interest is, what is that dividing line that separates something which is a specialized service, which is to say not falling under the requirements of the report and order having to do with reasonable network management and transparency and so forth, and what is covered. We used 2 case studies as a way to try to illustrate this, and I'll come back to the case studies in a second, but they're in the report. I think in terms of conclusions, we looked at the criteria that the FCC uses to define when something is or is not covered by the report and order. In informal conversation, the committee came to the conclusion that what the FCC was suggesting is that there are two criteria. One is if something is a general purpose service like IP, then it might conceivably fall under the order. If it's a specialized application, it does not. And the other was if this service, the general platform, is designed to essentially reach as far as the Internet. If it's got global reach, then it would fall into the order. If it's got a very narrow reach, then it would not. We identified one other criteria that might conceivably be helpful in distinguishing between something that is and is not, or should or should not be covered by the rules of the report, which is whether the capacity allocated to a specialized service is isolated to some significant degree from the capacity that's offered for Internet service. If something is claimed as a specialized service, but when you run it, it appears to consume the capacity that the consumer's been given for Internet, this seems to imply a kind of entanglement that the FCC should at least consider. So we called that out. We looked at some other criteria and concluded that none of them appeared to be definitional with the exception of that one. The two case studies that we looked at, the first one had to do with Internet video, IPTV, and what we worked through was a description of the evolution of the delivery of television, especially in the context of cable, where it started out as analog goes to digital but directly encoded in QAMs and is now moving to an encoding in IP. The point of this exercise is there's going to be an awful lot of stuff, video delivered, which is over IP but is a specialized service. And part of what that exercise went through is to try to identify some of the distinguishing characteristics of an over-the-top video service and a video service delivered by a facilities owner, typically what would be called MVPD video. We didn't conclude that those differences were definitional with the exception of this issue having to do with capacity isolation, which we bring to the attention of the FCC. But it's helpful to understand that there are going to be a range of applications, which in some sense the consumer will see as competing. They all look like video. Some of them are going to be specialized services. Some of them are going to be over the top. They're going to differ in various ways. The other case study had to do with the use of a specialized service to allow facilities owners to give services that are enhanced or distinguished in some way to third-party applications. That is to say, a specialized service can be used to allow a facilities owner to deliver a service that they themselves sell, such as television, but it also could be used as an alternative path for third-party services. The particular example we looked at that started this was an online multiplayer game that might be interested in having enhanced service under the terms of the report and order, which calls for limited forms of management. It appears that giving an application, allowing an application to purchase enhanced service may be forbidden by the order, or at least discouraged by the order. But our conclusion was that you could deliver the same thing by creating a consumer-facing specialized service. And I think the point here is there's a small point and a big point. The small point is that if you imagine that the point of the report and order is to mitigate certain harms that could arise if the operators can exercise forms of discrimination, that those options may still be available to the operator. Now, that doesn't mean that this subgroup concluded that those were harms. But if those options are available using a specialized service, it, in the small, begs the question, if you're concluding that those are harms and you're trying to mitigate them, then you need to get in there and adjust things. And in fact, when we were in California, we heard testimony from Barbara Vanschvik, who absolutely concludes that discrimination, various uses of, for example, quality of service, is more likely to lead to harms than benefits. Well, this is a contested point, of course, but she actually argued that the capabilities that the FCC should regulate or limit what can be done with specialized services, because she sees that as necessary to mitigate these harms. On the other hand, there may be benefits there. The committee in no sense made a choice there, and really what we're talking about is a bigger question than the Specialized Service Committee was supposed to look at. The big kahuna question is, do we understand whether the rules or the guidance in the report and order as to what would or would not be acceptable as reasonable network management is in fact positioned properly to balance harms and benefits. But the fact that you can do things using a specialized service that appear to be viewed as harmful in the order raises the bigger question of whether we've got that characteristic right, either in terms of the limitations on what those managed services, the limitations on reasonable network management are, or where the boundary line is that defines specialized services. The committee points out that the conversation about specialized services has sometimes centered on the idea that they could offer enhanced service qualities. People often talk about better control over latency for games, but the working group points out that the service can differ in lots of ways. It could, for example, differ in whether it has usage caps. It can differ in how it's priced. So there could be many ways in which a specialized service is differentiated from the traditional internet service. I think what the committee wants to do going forward, although we'll be discussing this later, is to come back to the second question of what the FCC should be doing to monitor the impact of specialized services on the internet service itself. And I don't think the committee has any conclusions at that point. We have some points of view. I should say that there are disagreements within the committee, both about how these issues are framed, and in particular there's a disagreement as to whether right now there's any reason for the FCC to reconsider the definition of specialized services. One argument is, look, everything here is speculative. No real issues have come up, so everything we're talking about is hypothetical. And so why don't we wait for the situation to mature before we do anything? The other point of view is there's some lack of clarity in these definitions that's probably going to bite us at some point, and it might be better to clean that up before people either take passive decisions, that is to say, not to go do something that might be beneficial, or to enter into alternative strategies for achieving things that will have to be remedied later. So the committee is not, or the subgroup is not clear, the committee is clear that it doesn't have an agreement on that point. And I think, in fact, there are some people on the committee that are uncomfortable with the way the report came out. So I do want to give a chance for other people on the committee to comment on what is said there. But this turned out to be a very difficult area to write about because of confusion about definition, confusion about the relationship between specialized services and the larger issue of what the report and order is trying to accomplish overall. And I think this is a checkpoint along the way, but I don't think we have the final answers here.
Thank you, David. Questions, comments, or additions to David and the working group's report?
Chip wants to say something.
Chip?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Professor Clark for chairing this difficult discussion. He has a very good way of making people think about things, in different ways and driving the work along. So I do appreciate the work we've done over the last year. And I think we had some excellent discussions in the working group to help really clarify some of the issues and some of the edge cases in the order, that we were trying to push the boundaries and see where things went. And it became one of the things we learned, of course, and also in the discussion of the mobility group is, that networks kind of have things that move beyond the blunt instruments of just blocking things. That there are different ways of doing things now and different ways of offering services over internet. Another one of the things we struggled with was with the IPTV is, and I think I may have mentioned it in one of the working group meetings, is with cable television or television offered over our frequencies. When you move your television service from offering over frequencies to working over IP, it shouldn't necessarily, become, invested under a different regulation or the open internet order just because it's running over IP. So that is some of the things that we discussed as well. One of the items I think that we at the very end we had some discussions on in terms of the definition of specialized services, and I think I was one of the people that looked at the examples as excellent ways of defining and discussing and clarifying, what we are talking about, and developing kind of a framework for thinking about these things. But I kind of stopped short of wanting to recommend that the FCC, clarify or redefine the term specialized services until we get, more experience in the marketplace. And that's where the monitoring aspect comes in, is that now that we've got some clarity over some of the hypothetical issues, we can now maybe look at monitoring what's going on in the markets and what's going on in the industry to see how the actual industry is evolving, given those frameworks and given those ideas that we've discussed. So I think that's one of the things that we kind of came to at the end is, and when we get to the point of looking forward is, recommending maybe looking at the monitoring aspect and saying, okay, how can we monitor these things and how can we monitor the market to watch for these items to see if there actually is a problem or a specific harm in terms of, the markets or customers or providers. So thank you very much.
Great. Maurice?
Adding to the points that Chip has made, I think this is getting towards definition has been an interesting endeavor. And it might be interesting for maybe a forward-looking view that in addition to monitoring, but also understanding a little more how services in the specialized services category are introduced, how they're classified as specialized services by providers is an interesting area. I was thinking of examples of the type of services that may be classified as specialized services, and I thought about home security services and how there are services today that may be classified as specialized services, but there are also services that in the marketplace that operate on using the best effort internet. And it occurred to me that one of the areas that would be interesting to provide better definition is understanding why a service would be specialized service if it could also be delivered over basic internet access services. Right, and if that doesn't, if there's some way of us understanding the kind of motivations for classifying a specialized services for those services, there is some, I guess, the secondary point. There is some risk possibly of a provider classifying a service as a specialized service to avoid some of the characteristics of best effort internet services, but if those are maybe useful to look at those in terms of its competitive landscape as well. Right? Are those aspects of those or characteristics of those delivery services available to other providers or edge providers maybe? So there are a number of different areas I think we should continue to look at.
Just a few small questions for you there, David. I don't know if you...
What, you want me to respond?
No, you don't have to. Just giving you an opportunity. Chuck wanted to get in too.
I think one of the points that is in the report, and I thought I would mention, and certainly from a provider perspective, the viewpoint that I think it's important to recognize is that the deployment of specialized services on a facility's infrastructure and access infrastructure actually benefits the broader internet services because it provides an additional set of services, additional set of revenue streams to essentially bolster the growth of the broadband capacity to subscribers. And so that complementary aspect, we talk about harms, and I think it's actually important to note that after a year of deliberation, the committee did not actually identify any real harms. And when there are, at least certainly from the provider's perspective, real benefits in terms of funding the growth of the access infrastructure. I also thought I would point out there is the potential of passive harms. For example, to the extent that in other parts of the world it is possible for edge providers to purchase quality of service, whereas in the United States, that particular practice may be, or at least we believe is, precluded by the OIO. That it's important, again, to monitor the potential passive harm of precluding practices in the U.S. that are actually used in other parts of the world. The Internet is an evolving thing. Innovation in the Internet ecosystem is important, and I think we don't want a regulatory environment that so constrains what operators can do that the innovation occurs in other parts of the world before it occurs in the United States.
I think one of the fascinating things about this area, and this is again a broader comment about reasonable network management and neutrality and so forth, is that practices that we view in this country with grave suspicion are becoming normal business practice in other countries. There is no regulatory theory which seems to be foundational. We're performing gigantic cross-country experiments here. And I think there's a very deep question, which is whether those experiments are comparable or whether the countries have different path dependencies such that you can't learn from what's happening in Asia or in Europe. I happen to think one should be able to learn, but in fact, I think an awful lot of people who are in the practice of regulation think domestically. And so I am intrigued by the fact that other parts of the world think it is pro-innovation and pro-consumer to do things that we seem to think are mostly associated with harms. And there's another dimension of monitoring here that one could do, which is looking over the fence and seeing what's happening in other parts of the world. But that's a rather ambitious activity. And so when we come to discussion of what we're going to do going forward, I think we need to think about the practical scope of ambition. But, right.
Kevin.
So one of the things that's probably not universally understood is specialized services have been around longer than, some of the specialized services have been around longer than the Internet's been around. And one of the things that, such as video and video distribution, and one of the things that I think we talked a lot about, and I encourage people to read the report, and Dave highlighted, I want to quote, is the open Internet regulation should not create a perverse incentive for operators to move away from converged IP infrastructure. And I think that's one of the important factors is over time, technology has evolved to deliver, the services that consumers expect, and as well as the ability to deliver the same services over the Internet. The Internet can deliver pretty much any service that you can deliver today, and I think that will always continue. But what I think we spent a lot of time discussing was we shouldn't do anything that discourages innovation and discourages technology advancements.
Let me just, sorry, did you have your hand up or no? Let me just again emphasize something that he said. There's an important distinction here, which is, I think, often lost in some of the superficial rhetoric, which is the distinction between something running over the Internet and something running over the Internet protocol on facilities' own infrastructure. The things that are running over the Internet protocol in general fall in this category of specialized services. And what Kevin just read specifically said regulation should not, open Internet regulation should not create a perverse incentive for operators to move away from a converged IP infrastructure. And using IP, that is to say running on something on top of the Internet protocols, should not imply a regulatory burden imposed related to any regulation of the Internet. And I think this distinction is lost in a lot of rhetoric. People blur the word the Internet and running on top of IP. But a related point in here is that a service should not escape or acquire a regulatory burden by moving to IP. That is to say, if you're running television today over QAMs and you go through a technological conversion such that it's running over IP over QAMs, that in and of itself should not imply a change of its regulatory burden. If it was covered by Title VI before, it's covered by Title VI now. If it was, now this, of course, what I just said is in amazingly amazingly contentious if you stop and listen to me, because what it would say is that the move of telephony to IP TV would not change its Title II status, and that has been, lightning bolts will come out of the sky if I suddenly start pointing out telephony fits under this, but the FCC has officially declared itself uncertain as to whether voice over IP is covered by Title II. And in fact, if you tried to, and we're beyond the scope of the subcommittee here, if you actually tried to impose all of the rules of Title II on internet telephony, they do not make technical sense. But now we're criticizing the Telecommunications Act, and I should shut up and we should go on to the next topic.
It's always when it gets interesting, David.
What, did I stop?
Well, that early in the working group's tenure, you raised a number of concerns that loosely hang around the idea of the dirt road. And I don't know if you were coming out of this year-long experience worried about the dirt road the same way you were before. And I just wanted to give you a chance to speak to that and then hear from Brad and Shane.
Well, by the way, the dirt road image is that if specialized services turn out to be a powerful way to deliver consumer experiences and a source of revenue, that the capacity of the IP infrastructure that belongs to the facilities owners might be primarily dedicated to specialized services, and the capacity or the other service features associated to the internet might erode or fail to grow, so that over time the internet becomes less and less appealing as a platform for over-the-top applications. So this is the dirt road future for the information superhighway. I think this is a topic for us going forward. There are some economic models in this space, which the subcommittee hasn't discussed, so I would just say there's some literature in the area. But we have a tentative point of view, and this is not a conclusion, but we have a tentative point of view that, in fact, instead of telling the FCC it should monitor all the specialized services, what the FCC should be doing is looking at what the internet experience is today, and the question is, how could you determine when the internet experience is good enough that, no, it's not a dirt road, it's a perfectly adequate highway? We have some points of view on that, and I think that's really a point of agenda for the next year.
Got it. Brad?
So I've heard, and this is a theme that comes up again and again as we talk about these issues, that we want to encourage innovation and we want to encourage investment. And regardless of where you come from, whether you're a carrier or whether you invest in applications providers, you want to encourage innovation and you want to encourage investment. The difference is, and I think it's important for us to begin to model these, is really the question of innovation and investment where. And there's a significant difference between innovation in the network and innovation on the network. And if we can begin to be more disciplined in the way we use those terms to say, in this case, I'm referring to innovation in the network and not innovation on the network, it would be really, I think, helpful in clarifying. Obviously, the problem with that simplistic model is that when you get to specialized services, you blur that distinction because you'd like to be able to innovate in the network in a way that is revealed as an innovation on the network. So the consumer's experience is different because of an innovation that you make in the network. The trade-off that we're making there is between the ability to innovate and invest in the network as a carrier or as an infrastructure provider, and the ability to innovate independently as an applications layer provider. And when the carriers are innovating and investing in the network in a way that compromises the freedom to innovate on the network, because as an example, there's at least a theoretical harm that if a carrier is offering a service based on some proprietary hooks in the network that are not available to an application provider providing that service on the network, it's going to make it difficult for someone to invest in that application provider. So, it is a complicated set of issues, but I think we can clarify it at least to a degree if we are constantly, trying to come back to where is this innovation and where is this investment that we're talking about.
Got it. Shane and then Alyssa?
Yeah, a question maybe you could speak to. When you talk about monitoring the situation, it sort of begs the question, what data would facilitate monitoring and what might that look like? And I have to admit, I mean it on a fairly simple level. It might actually be the answer's complicated, but what fraction of households are we talking about? How much data traffic are we actually talking about? What sort of symptoms or signs can be easily monitored to address maybe some of the open questions going forward? So that sort of, there have been thoughts about that.
So I'll give you a point of view that I think some people on the subgroup accept, but we have not talked about enough to in any sense make it a conclusion. We asked ourselves whether we saw any technical parameters of the internet service today. There are being measured by things like the Measuring Broadband America program. Could we identify any additional technical parameters that we thought would be appropriate given this issue of balancing specialized services? And the answer was no. I'm not convinced that's the final answer, but we looked, if you look at Measuring Broadband America, they're looking at things like throughput and losses and latency, all this kind of stuff, and we couldn't think of anything else. The tough question is not, should we have more parameters or how many households? The question is, what constitutes good enough? And the conclusion, at least, I'll just say it as my point of view, although I think there's some people that bought into this, that the way to begin is by looking at the consumer experience. And in fact, the term quality of experience, QoE, is showing up in the literature to talk about the application level consumer-facing experience. And if you look at a basket of applications today, telephony, video, cruising the web, playing a game, you can actually do consumer-facing subjective experiences, sort of a Moss number for these things. And by looking at a basket of applications and what the Moss number is, as a function of the technical parameters, you can begin to compare services. So you might also say, well, let's find some leading edge applications, things that look like innovations that people would like to try now, and ask what their Moss scores look like. And you could say, well, the internet's good enough for today, but it's not good enough to let this kind of innovation going on, so we'd like better than good enough. But I think that's the way to talk about it, as opposed to saying we want to put in new numbers or new households or something like that. With respect to specific applications like streaming video, people who do streaming video, Netflix, Google, they actually know a lot about the relationship between technical parameters of the network and the quality of the consumer experience. So, but that's for the next year. Right.
Alyssa.
So I was kind of mulling over this idea that Dave and Chucky both mentioned about this sort of cross-country comparison, and I think Brad's comments kind of crystallized it for me, which is that I think, regulatory attention tends to be national because you're regulating an access network, right, or a telecom provider who probably only provides in your country or in a region. But at the application layer, you can be providing globally. And so what I think would be kind of interesting is to not only look, if people are interested in doing cross-country comparison, which I think is a good thing to do, not only look at the differences in terms of what the carriers are offering, but also look at the differences in the application layer innovation landscape. Because I think, there's probably lots of reasons why, not to pick on Maurice, but there's lots of reasons why Netflix started in the U.S. and later entered into the UK market or the German market or the Spanish market, as opposed to the opposite. And, you can look at the way that the access networks are regulated in these other countries and say, you can have much more flexibility, you can do two-sided pricing, you can do all these things because you don't have something there like the open internet order. But then you also have to ask, well, where is all the content coming from? Where are all the applications coming from that people in other countries are using? And something that I hear a lot in policy is that there's lots of other countries' regulatory regimes that are the regulators get upset or nervous because of the kind of excessive influence of the U.S. application providers and the U.S. content companies coming over there and pushing their stuff. So it'd be interesting to do that kind of comparison to say if it's local application developers that are buying into the kinds of priority regimes or two-sided pricing regimes, or if it's international ones. I think that would tell us a lot about, give a little bit more richness to the cross-country comparison.
Maybe building on that idea a bit, and all the comments is, it seems to me there'd be very little harm in trying to quantify extent of innovation in the different environments, whether it's pricing model, whether it's offers, whether it's services delivery, where rather like we did on the broadband speed, it should be possible to quantify dimensions of innovation that are being employed globally, and to see if there's any correlation with regulatory framework. Maybe completely uncorrelated, maybe correlated, maybe more related to GDP. I mean, that, I think, independent of the actual sort of testing or the MOS piece, which I think is, the MOS piece is still a technical service definition. It would be interesting if we looked more at the sort of business dynamic that simply says, does regulation and innovation correlate in a meaningful way? And if so, what are the types of parameters that we see being the ones where they actually go hand in hand, and where do they actually serve to perhaps have perverse incentives? Back to the point about moving to IP, creating a perverse incentive, maybe we can find something there that's worth looking at. More in the business domain than the technology/service domain.
Got it. Shall we move to transparency? Last word from Kevin?
Yeah, Dave mentioned the comment about monitoring, and I think this is kind of be one of our follow-throughs, but one of the things that I wanted to mention, I talked about it at the last meeting in Chicago, is the internet experience and the service experience. A lot of things we talk about is, well, it's my broadband experience, but in general, it's an end-to-end view, and we spend a lot of time monitoring the access side of the network, but as we start looking to explore the overall end-to-end user experience, I think that expands what we want to look at. If my broadband speed is measured and consistent and reported with Sam Knows and Measuring Broadband for America as a 30 meg stream, why can't I get a 1 meg video stream? What's the problem there? So one of the things I mentioned last time in Chicago is really the what makes up the internet experience is about at least 7 things. It's the content quality offered by the edge service provider. What's the bit rate being offered? It's the content distribution system being used, the servers out there, the data centers they're in, the load balancers that are being used, the ISP of the content distribution system that's being used to send to me, or the first mile of the communication path, the internet path it travels. Then you get into the last mile elements. Then you get into the in-the-home scenarios, wireless, and then you get into the device. So really, my experience of either doing an internet phone call or watching a video or downloading a web page is not just the broadband experience. It's really that end-to-end that I think from a monitoring standpoint, I think we should spend a little bit more time on.
What makes it sound like maybe the kind of ecosystem analysis that the mobile group did could be performed in this area for specialized services. Final word from Matthew before we move to...
I'm not sure if this group talked about this. I'm not part of this group, but I don't know if you guys had talked about actually having access to specialized services by alternative providers and small carriers. Because I can tell you, one of the issues we run into as provider of broadband to end users is we're starting to see issues with getting access to backbone. And I can just give you a quick example. There is a FCC-funded rural Nebraska health network that has a bundle of fibers that terminates about 75 feet from the back of my NOC, and I can't get access to that network. There's fiber all over the place, and alternative providers, small providers, don't necessarily always have access to that. And I don't know if being able to access those networks is anything that was talked about in your discussion, but I think it might be something to look at in the future.
And is that in the context of specialized services, or just...
Yes, I'm talking about using those kind of services to connect between different points on a network. For example, this network I'm talking about
I could connect up to multiple communities. I currently serve with microwave, but I'd much rather use fiber because that would enable us to overcome a backbone bottleneck.
Got it.
But instead, I've got to go through 2 different gatekeepers to actually get on part of the network, whereas it'd be much more efficient if I could connect directly up to it. And I think especially in the situation now, obviously if Comcast puts in their own fiber network, I don't expect that they should have to cater to my whims, but especially on government subsidized networks that are either getting money from Connect America or directly from like broadband stimulus, there should be some kind of provision for small provider and alternative providers to be able to access those in a fair and neutral manner.
Well, that definitely seems an issue worthy of bringing up 2 beats hence when we talk about the overall committee's things to look at for the next year. Let's move to transparency. Russ?
So some consumers are not able to easily compare internet service offerings, and to correct the situation, the Transparency Working Group is encouraging the FCC to promote a voluntary labeling program that covers both mobile and fixed services. A simple and consistent label will enable consumers to make apples-to-apples comparisons when considering an internet service selection or when considering a change. The proposed label would cover performance, price, and usage restrictions. While mobile and data networks are rapidly evolving, both fixed and mobile connections are both a significant part of today's network experience. For this reason, service providers that do not offer access to the entire public internet should not make use of this label. To participate in the label program, ISPs self-report 3 pieces of data: upload speed, download speed, and monthly price. To reflect the long-term cost to the consumer, an average monthly price over 36 months, including all taxes and fees, is proposed. In addition, if there are any usage restrictions, including data caps, ISPs need to report them as well. These numbers are very far from a complete picture of an internet service offering, yet they seem to be the right level of detail for most consumers. These numbers do not capture important technical factors such as jitter, latency, and the impacts of over-provisioning. Further, determining the price is not always straightforward, especially when bundling is taking place with other services and the internet service. However, a label presentation on a website can be done very straightforward manner. For example, a consumer can provide their location, and the website can then display all of the applicable offerings and a label associated with each of those offerings. As a next step, the Transparency Working Group recommends that the FCC work with industry to develop a voluntary labeling program in which ISPs would disclose on their websites in a simple, consistent manner the relevant information for their broadband internet offerings. The Transparency Working Group is confident that the label program will make it easier and less confusing for American consumers when choosing an internet service offering. So I encourage you to take a look at the report, which talks about both the pros and the cons of such a label and the complexities that I've outlined here in much greater detail. And at this point, I'm open to questions.
Thank you. Any questions or comments on the transparency report or working group? Maurice.
I wonder if the nutrition label approach is a fascinating approach, and I think it's an area of interesting works, particularly where standardization can occur in the area of informing consumers. I wonder for the next round of discussion if application level performance or goodput across internet services as opposed to the access layer or component of services, similar to the point that Kevin made earlier, could be introduced into these into the labeling, the measurements, the monitoring idea. And if this has been discussed, I wonder how that. I wonder if it would be useful to have maybe some application providers contribute some ideas around measurement.
So it was discussed only superficially, in the sense that we were looking at internet service offerings, but at the same time we recognized this notion of good enough that was discussed earlier, and that is different for different applications and different connections, fiber, Wi-Fi, LTE, so on, are going to offer different experiences to the consumer. And so we quickly steered away from that, since we were focusing on the internet service offering that a consumer would be choosing, recognizing that a particular consumer may have all of those in their experience with the internet in one day. So it actually makes the kind of label that you're talking about for a particular application quite difficult. But that was the extent to which it was discussed.
Thanks. Chuck, did you say?
Yeah, I think I'll make 2 points. One, actually both of which are covered in the report. One is that the committee did spend a fair bit of time, talking about, and this gets to Morris's point a little bit, the desire at some level to base the performance data that's in the label on large-scale field measurements. And I think the compromise that it turns out that basing the performance data on large-scale field or customer measurements is just today not technically feasible because of the lack of accepted standards in deployed customer equipment. So that is a long-term goal. And there is work in both the Broadband Forum and the IETF to define the standards on which such measurements might be based. But the equipment that's in the field today, with the exception of the small number of SAM nose boxes that have been deployed for the Measuring Broadband America program, that's not a broad base sort of large-scale customer measurement approach. And so the compromise that was taken here was to not wait for that sort of large-scale deployment to occur, but to try to do something based on the existing sort of published data from providers and provide it to consumers in a standardized way. So it was a compromise based on the sort of near-term reality, as it were. So that is at least in part an attempt to address Morris's point. I think the other comment, and this was again a debate that we had back and forth in the group, and different people chose to came out on different places. There still is a question in my mind as to whether price belongs in a nutrition-like label. Certainly, if you take the analogy of the label on the side of the cereal box, it talks about the product. But the price, which is something that can change, is usually listed on the side of the shelf or something in some other way. And so so there is I think a recommendation that issue of whether price should be included be part of the public discussion, assuming that the FCC wants to move forward with the label program. And the concern is in part that if the price that's disclosed in the label is some sort of a 36-month average, Prices change. Is there a possibility actually of increasing consumer confusion rather than reducing consumer confusion? So I think one needs to probably get in a little bit more detail about it to really understand, are we helping by including price in the label or not?
Alyssa.
Yeah, I was just wondering, this was a question that I had when I read the report actually, is if there's something that prevents the label from being updated, because it seems like it's a pretty dynamic thing, right? But not hard to calculate either. So it, as the product offerings change, the labels change as well. Was that kind of discussed?
That was one of the motivations for putting it on the website, so that as the offerings change, they're accurate. The reason for the 36-month forward look was the idea that there's very often sign-up incentives, and you want to know how that overall picture is going to be reflected as you reach the end of the sign-up incentive and later on. So if the price goes up, the average will reflect that. And it was just trying to get to a way to provide a constant, by that I mean the same view of various different offerings, so that consumers can make an educated decision based on their perception of their needs.
Got it. Harvey.
Russell, did the committee have a chance to talk about labeling for disclosure policies for ISPs?
You mean like what their privacy policies are and wiretap and all these things, or what do you mean by disclosure?
That's exactly what
okay.
I meant. Under transparency.
Right. So that wasn't the topic that we were taking on. That's an interesting topic, but I don't think that's what transparency meant in terms of the Open Internet Order. It had to do with being clear what the management practices are of the network and so on, that you're not. I think that if you look back at the history, you'll see that blocking of certain traffic was the kind of management practice that they were striving for, but we felt that the fact that so many consumers were confused about the offerings that were available and how to compare them that's a place where transparency was needed.
Brad.
I have to, first of all, commend Harvey for bringing up that issue. I do think it's one that we're going to need to pay attention to going forward. And then specifically talking about measuring upload and download speeds. Obviously, that's only telling you something about the access network. And if we go back to Matthew's concern about getting access to the backbone, the only thing that really matters to the consumer is going to be the measurement that Maurice is proposing from an applications perspective. How long did it take me to download the movie? And if there is a reason that a backbone provider perhaps is discriminating against a small carrier out on the edge, even if that carrier is providing fiber to the home, that movie may take a while to get downloaded. And so I wonder if there's any way to address that kind of complexity.
Well, we did talk about that, and it's actually very complicated when you look at all the 7 links in the model that Kevin talked about. It's very clear that the ISP can only provision their piece of the network, and then there's kind of a dependency on those other providers. And so we would expect that most of these providers offer a way for the consumer to go to the website and say, what am I getting to the edge of my ISP's network? And there are many test sites throughout the internet that lets you see what am I getting to that test site. So you can compare the two and see if you're getting the same to the backbone as you are within the network.
But if you add in CDN and
Sure.
distributed compute infrastructure, it's now where is your application hosted, and that's where I want to know what connectivity I get to that space. or to that endpoint. So I think it becomes very complicated.
But with the cloud, that's not the same every day.
Right.
Okay.
So the point is, should we recognize that the label, although a worthy endeavor, really can only apply to a portion of the network, and simply say beyond that you should do application level testing of your own? It might be better to, rather than solve the problem end to end, which probably is intrinsically undoable and increasingly undoable over time, and if there's a label, it's defined as only a portion of the experience, and you argue, well, to the point is, would the user care about that label? And that's where it's not clear that the answer is yes anymore. But I think we should parse it to say this is the only portion we can reasonably label. Is in fact that of value to the end consumer to label that? If not, perhaps decide not. So I think it's important that we parse the problem correctly in order not just to do work towards a goal that is unachievable.
It certainly points out that the label metaphor from Nutrition Facts on Food at some point is more dissimilar than it is similar. I suppose it doesn't mean that one would just give up. There's just a pile of food and I'm going to eat it. But it does show it's a hard solution to find. I know we want to be able to talk as a full group and work in public comment, so maybe we should hear from Chip and Dennis, and then unless there's anybody who desperately wants to get in, we'll move to our next section. Chip.
Okay, just 2 quick points. First, I thank Russ for his chairing this group for the last year. I appreciate his leadership and working on these issues. And 2 points. One is, I think one thing discussion I made in the group, I think it's in the report, is the importance that if this moves forward, that maintaining consistency between the Measuring Broadband America and any type of label is really important in terms of definitions and terminology and how things are measured.
Yes,
so
that's
that
in there.
People just don't get more confused.
Right.
The other one is just to notify in terms of the measurement, the IETF. So the IETF just formed a new working group, the Large Scale Measurement of Broadband Performance Working Group, LMAP. It was just recently formed. I think they're going to probably hold their first meeting at the Berlin is it next week or a couple of weeks? Sometime real soon. Yes. So anybody who wants to actually participate in the technical discussion there, they can go have a place to go look now and discuss it in the IETF. Thank you.
Dennis.
The other element of this, given the complexity, there is the potential of a service provider skewing the numbers, if you will, to advantage if this does become useful. So one of the questions that, and I just took another look to make sure that I wasn't missing it, and perhaps that's still true, but there doesn't seem to be any enforcement mechanism called out by the group. And I think that's going to be
That's
required.
Right. We were looking for a voluntary program, not any enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, the difficulty with a voluntary program, if there is the potential for economic advantage, is that there is motivation to provide numbers that may or may not be realistic, and then you get into this difficulty of how meaningful are the numbers if there is no means of regulating the veracity of the input.
The feeling was that right now ISPs are offering statements about the performance of their offerings on their websites, and if those were lies, you would have ways of taking action against that ISP, and that those same mechanisms would apply to the label.
Yeah, I mean, there's still truth in advertising,
Exactly.
and, right? There's a broader kind of regulatory regime which doesn't have to be specific to this, but which certainly applies to anyone who's offering a product to the public, right? So, in general, you are not supposed to lie when you're advertising to customers. But I think actually the more difficult question that you point to is about gaming the actual measurements themselves, which is a super hot topic among people who are defining the metrics and how do you actually measure on the wire. And I think in some ways passive measurement provides a way out of that, because if you're measuring the while the person is actually watching the video or making the call, much less likely to game that measurement. But passive measurement has a whole other set of issues that it brings with it.
On this particular point, I sense Henning really wanting to say something. So, Henning.
I'll just give a little bit of, if you like, philosophical background in terms of the measurement side. There was, I think, some unstated assumption that they were really, and this is not completely correct from a network architecture perspective, that there were essentially two actors that had somewhat divergent interests. Namely, from an application vendor, generally speaking, they have it in their interest to provide the best possible quality to the extent that they control it by choosing CDN vendors and all of that, because if people abandon the video content, they're probably not going to watch the advertisement, or they're not going to renew the video subscription, for example. It is much harder for a consumer to measure the technical characteristics of a network. What has made that more complicated recently is that the network really has divided essentially into, roughly speaking, three pieces for much of the content, namely the CDN piece, the access piece, and the handoff between the two. Namely where the two interact, where the wide area networks and the CDNs interconnect with the access network. And as I suspect many of us know, this has been a subject of some contention, known as peering disputes, which is probably not quite the right terminology, but it indicates where the interface is and where there is some dispute as to when the quality impairment can reasonably be laid at that boundary as to who's responsible for the issues that arise in that. Kind of similar to what happens when you have border crossings between countries and everybody blames the other one as to why things aren't moving as fast as you would like them to. So that, I think, has complicated the consumer perspective, where the consumer is left wondering as to why is my video not loading, and there is a good deal of mutual finger pointing going on. I don't think the label can in itself cure that. I will point out that we are actively discussing in the MBA program to look at, periodically at least, at the performance as visible all the way to the CDN without trying to necessarily attribute performance impairments to particular components, but to see if the access network is indeed still a reasonable approximation as the bottleneck link in that. And that used to be a pretty good approximation. That may be increasingly less so, unfortunately.
Got it. All right. Thank you for that report from Transparency. I think as we can see from each of the four check-ins from the working groups and the corresponding texts, that I think we're now in a position to be ready to send onward to the Commission and to the public. This is really complex, and it doesn't always, in fact, maybe ever reduce that well to a bumper sticker. And I just personally want to thank everybody on the committee for coming together and being able to talk this stuff through and whittle it down into its wee bits and be able to represent it with the level of nuance that it calls for. Our plan from here on out is to be able to take the products of each of those four working groups, the briefing documents that led off the committee's work in the year, and the executive summaries, which people have had a chance to look at and discuss somewhat, to bundle that together with a transmittal letter from me and David Clark, our vice chair, and be able to deliver that to the Commission and to the public as some sense of the work we've done over the past year. I was thinking it also might be appropriate to invite, without requiring, each member of the committee to submit up to 500 words, no more, in additional thoughts or departure or anything else you might want to say that we would bundle along with that to be made available again to the Commission and to
dissenting opinions.
It could be concurrences, dissents, or as our court sometimes has it, concurring in part 1A, little I of the judgment, but dissenting from part. Can be whatever you like, and it also means it could be about process as well as substance. It's an opportunity, at least, to speak directly with one's voice which often is subordinated in the working group and overall committee process in order to achieve consensus and something that we can all sign off. Again, not a requirement, but something for which there's an opportunity. And I suppose if we were really working on the judicial metaphor, anybody could also choose to associate him, her, or itself with the remarks of any other person or institution weighing in. So unless there are strong objections to that, that's how I'm thinking we should proceed and be able then to place a marker for what we've done and then begin the next year's work. Does that sound good to people, Shane?
Yeah, timeline?
The timeline, I was thinking 2 weeks. And that way be able to collect it, circulate it a little bit, see if there's anybody who wants to sign on to anyone else's, and then more or less by the end of this month be ready to tie a bow on it, release it to the public, et cetera.
And this report would go out 2 weeks from now as well? Or
No, I think we should bundle it all together so everybody has everything with all context. So that's what this report would do too. And I suppose, I think we should probably consider these things done and baked unless there's some late-breaking epiphany or change to the world. I was just reading a Wikipedia page about Wikipedia's preparations for a humanity-terminating event in which all Wikipedia editors are sort of immediately printing out articles and stowing them. But short of that, I think we
this
might
is
consider
the end of
it
technology?
Yes,
They're going to fall back on paper?
20-pound acid-free paper.
Wicked cool.
Yes. There's an entry on that. So, sound pretty good? So, with that said, we should move to our next section. But Tejas, are you wanting to say something?
Well, I did just want to say one thing and extend our thanks to the group in general. I know that it's a significant investment of time and resources on the part of everybody here to really, to share your expertise with us and with the commission in particular. And so we really appreciate the time, the hour each week, the 2 to 4 hours of time each week that all of you have taken to contribute to this substantial report. So thank you very much. And a special thanks to the working group chairs, to Shane, Jen, David, and Russ, and then also to you, Professors Clark and Citrain, for chairing the committee. So thank you all very, very much for all your work and expertise and everything that you've done over the past year to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you. All right, so normally after that feel-good moment, we would cut to a commercial break, but there is none, so we're going to just keep charging through. And I'd like to start with the committee, and then at the right moment, we'll open up to public input as well, starting to think about our goals for the next year. And I think that includes thinking through who is our audience. It's most literally the commission. We are an advisory committee to that commission, but we also ultimately release our work publicly, so it may be the public at large as well. And it's also interesting to note in our chartering that we are invited to suggest changes, amendments to the open internet order, and not simply take it as etched in stone and then figure out how to work with it. And I think it's actually quite constructive that in our first year we less focused on changes to the order itself and more on working under it, and in fact tried to avoid interpreting the order where there might be dispute about it. But there is that invitation within the order for us to actually make recommendations to the commission on that front. I think there's also opportunity to think about our meeting formats, how to make the most of the fact that, as Tejas was saying, a lot of people that have a lot going on are coming together to be working on this, and then also ultimately having to travel and set aside part of a day. So how to really make that most useful. I already broached the idea of potentially soliciting, I only put it in quotes because it shouldn't sound so formal, but essentially testimony or other input from experts or others in the world that might be able to help us out. I'm also curious if people had views on taking our committee on the road. That was an unusual departure from form that we did rather early on. and it might be worth thinking about how helpful that was if we continue to do it, how to make the most of being in different places in the country, or if we should recede and make this room our home when we meet in person for every meeting. We should be thinking a little bit about our working groups and whether there should be new ones, retiring some existing ones, or reconfigurations. One thought perhaps worth putting on the table is the idea of kind of rapid reaction team working groups, either a standing one for that purpose or a convening one when something does hit the public eye or seems to be of some controversy. I think of the way in which the mobile group handled the AT&T FaceTime question. With AT&T represented on this committee, at first I think that may have been seen as potentially awkward. I think we actually made the most of that fact and were able to generate a report that really delved into a lot of the issues, and I think could stand as a roadmap for people wanting to get up to speed on that. There will be other such issues that come up, and maybe we should be ready to rapidly, in a matter of weeks rather than months sort of thing, respond to them. And finally, just at large, are there particular topics that would be worth taking up? And a number of suggestions came up as each of the 4 working groups checked in. We will be and have been taking notes on those, and we'll go back through the recording of the meeting to make sure we didn't miss anything. So don't feel like you have to say them again unless you want to emphasize them or elaborate upon them. And I've got a few ideas myself, but first want to open the floor on that. And finally, too, we might have things we want to suggest to the Commission about membership of the committee, expanding it or adjusting it or anything else. So that's my invitation to the rest of the committee to weigh in on our future. The floor is open. David, should we start with you as our vice chair?
So let me begin by saying something that's going to sound perhaps cranky, but I think the committee has to be very clear about this. I appreciate the kind words from Tejas about the work we've put in, but and I think it's important that people in the public understand this. There are no FCC resources going into the support of this committee. Right? None. Aside from the fact he's sitting there.
Well, and don't forget Henning's participation.
Oh, and Henning is sitting there, right.
By none, you mean few.
Right. So if you go back to the conversation we had about specialized services, and we talked about, well, maybe we could be looking across borders at other countries, or we could be doing some studies of quality of experience. If we were not sitting in this room, those activities would be called research. That is to say, you would submit a grant, you would get some money, you would do the work, and you could actually get a publication out of it. Those are big projects. I think they are important projects, but this committee cannot casually say, oh, let's do this and let's do that, because we do have 1 hour a week, at least those of us from academia who are not paid to do this. And none of these things are going to happen effectively unless we understand where the manpower is coming from to do them and how they can be done in a way that they meet the criteria, that is to say they're done in a balanced way that represents people's interests. And we should not be ambitious unless we understand how we're going to execute. I don't know what the Commission wants from us. The Commission itself is in a state of transition. We don't know what the new chairman's going to want. And if, in fact, we are doing work that is primarily public-facing, it is not clear to me that having the imprimatur of the FCC helps. Many good research results occur without having the imprimatur of the FCC on them. And in fact, it's easier to fund them because then I can do them as an MIT employee as opposed to doing them as a special employee of the FCC, which means I cannot use FCC funds, MIT funds to do them. I think we should be, I hate it whenever, when I worked at the computer board at the National Academies, I hated it that every study ended up with a section at the back which was an agenda for research. And it was sort of like, hey, let's do a special pleading for ourselves and write a research agenda for ourselves. But I think we should be focusing on what can this committee do, what should we be trying to encourage the larger community to do, and by the way, where would you send them for money, And what role should industry be playing? And the benefit of this is, in fact, there are multiple points of view represented here. That was an issue that generated a lot of tension in the specialized study, but in the subgroup. But in the end, working toward that consensus is very powerful. What role should industry be playing in trying to produce results that are balanced and credible? And that ought to be part of any conversation about what we are going to do going forward, because otherwise we're going to be just having happy little dreams that we can't execute.
I think it's extremely helpful, these comments, and we should bear that in mind. It is true that the committee is structured primarily in the stakeholder representation model, and it's one for which then being able to achieve agreement on certain things might be very difficult if the stakeholders are structurally not in a position to agree. And often the role of researchers is to simply weigh in with those researchers' view of the truth. That is somewhat a different function. And I know I should note, essentially for the record, that the way in which the stakeholder model then has been put to the best use is by, where there are points of departure, being able to, in the respective working groups and their reports, clearly delineate points of view so that the commission, in weighing a particular policy, is aware of where each stakeholder stands and can give that whatever weight the commission in its wisdom wants to give it. I know that on research agendas, forgive me, Shane, if I am misremembering that it was you who suggested this, but it being a kick-started to 21st century kind of environment we're in, there may be some way to set up essentially a research exchange where we actually try to put out questions that allow themselves of factual or theoretical inquiry and invite groups to weigh in on it, kind of like the appendix of the CSTB reports that did not excite you, David. But there may be ways to sort of put those up, not for bid, but to say, here is a need, and if you throw a rock in the air, at least in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you will hit a graduate student in need of a topic for something. And this seems a less violent way of bringing in contribution from those who may be able to so contribute.
See, whenever I throw a rock, I hit a grad student who's looking for funding.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. You're in a rather special place, sir.
Why does that not sound like a compliment?
I wouldn't mind being in a place that had enough of an endowment that when you looked at a grad student, the first question is, why am I out of money?
Uh-huh.
But certainly, the traditional places that academics go for funding, if you're a computer scientist, don't know how to fund this stuff because they can't recognize it because it doesn't look like writing code. So
yes.
There are issues about whether the rule one is supposed to be do good research. No, rule one is make sure you don't have to fire yourself so that you can continue to work so that you can execute rule two, and rule two is do good research.
The zeroth rule of any organism is to survive.
Well, I was giving it rule one, but that's okay. That's right. Yes, right. We just had a plus or minus one bug there.
Uh-huh. I invoked Shane's name. We should hear from him if he wants to weigh in, and I know Jennifer, as another of our academics, might want to say something on this.
I would say you partially got me quoted correctly. That you are correct that I have noted already in informal conversations I have with graduate students. I don't hit them with rocks, but that.
This is how rumors start.
But this, yeah. Participating in this group has generated generated awareness about a number of open questions that a student could address, and that's the part you've accurately quoted me on. I admit I had not translated into a concrete form like a research exchange, but that would be a formal way to do it. I'm not objecting to that. Just saying, yeah, I actually agree. One of the really, really interesting things as an academic who works in this area is we've defined. You read these reports. I will send a graduate student to some of what we've written here. The committees have written because it's frontier. It's as good as anything you can find, and it defines a number of open questions that someone with a curious mind and a lot of time. Not necessarily funding, could potentially address.
Jennifer and then Melissa?
Kind of a few points. One is just echoing something that Dave said. We definitely in the mobile broadband group needed technical expertise that we didn't have as individuals, and also information about the economics of the marketplace that we didn't have as individuals. And particularly Chuck and Marcus and people within their teams at AT&T and Alcatel-Lucent filled a gap for us. I mean, by participating in our calls on occasion or providing us statistics we didn't have. But it would have been great to have some sort of resources on our team to be able to do some of that tracking down of work. There are other groups we could reach out to, like BTAG, which I know has approached both Dave and myself to come visit them in October. So they might be another group we could reach. But I think, what if we had some more members that brought in some of the technical expertise on the group, or a more formal way to bring them in as outside experts more frequently, I think that would certainly be a recognition of the time they're spending helping us out. A second issue that came up earlier in the meeting is that we don't have expertise from Apple or Google on the committee to help us with issues around app stores and operating systems. And having Harvey is helpful on the OS side, but having more representation on sort of the OS app store side of things, both technically and business-wise, would certainly in our group have been quite helpful, whether as outside experts or as actual members of the committee. And third, we had a number of issues in the mobile broadband group that understandably overlapped with other working groups. A couple of concrete ones, certainly two-sided pricing is one that we kind of touched on a little bit but stayed away from because it obviously overlapped with other groups, and monitoring, which has some interesting issues that are unique to mobile but are also quite broad and not specific just to mobile. And so I think we struggled a bit with some scoping questions that might be helpful. I'm not sure we need to refactor the groups. Maybe that's the right thing to do, but figuring out to make sure that some of these topics don't get ignored because neither group takes it on because they assume it's in the scope of the other.
Got it. Alyssa, are you going to speak to the resource question or something else?
Yeah, I just had one kind of short response to what Dave was saying.
Yeah.
Jen said most of what I was going to say, actually, which is that one way to solve the resource problem is to leverage outside experts, which I think we did quite well in the mobile group. But I think it's interesting to me, I guess in academia you don't have the same trick that we have in the public interest, which is that you take some work that you're already doing, which is funded, and you use it again. So this is something that we do all the time because of resource constraints. And I think that this is a version of what we did in the mobile group, which was that we already knew that there was existing work that people were doing, and so we just brought it into the group. And that's something that we could do more of, but I think also serves to kind of focus us, right? And so, to me, the cross-country comparison thing is interesting because I'm already doing a lot of it. So I think that's one way to kind of orient us, is that, we don't need to go off and create a whole bunch of new work for ourselves because we're all, to some extent, already working on specific topics or projects that have some slant that can be reused for this purpose. So that's all.
There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Right, and I mean, right. It might be that some people can't do it because of funding restrictions or something, but that's something that we do a lot.
No, if I can just respond to that. Everybody has their own problem with funding, and you do too, and you pick your priorities. And bringing work of that sort into this committee is I think, equally appropriate for a public interest group, academic, anybody like that. And in fact, it can go both ways in the sense that some conversation might inspire you to use your resources, or inspire one of us as researchers to go off and do a study whose primary focus is the outreach venues that you traditionally use. But that can be brought here as well as an input. Right. What I'm saying is that's subtly different than the work that the committee has assigned itself. And in some sense, it's good fortune if work that we think is important as a committee is something we can find somebody who has got the resources to do. Right. But we don't have any resources to marshal ourselves, so we have to be passive in that respect, except as we can be cunning.
I'd like to step back a little bit, because I think we've got off almost into an academic realm, and it's no coincidence it was primarily academics speaking. I think my point is only that we're almost going after this for the sake of research, for the academic interest's sake. I think what we need is the FCC to provide feedback on what they thought of what we've done so far, because I think these are fascinating topics, but in terms of how we spend our time, it probably should we should wait for some feedback from some FCC entity or new chair to say what do they think of the work we've done so far, and do they want to provide some direction as to which things are more important than others, and maybe then is there some funding mechanism or preferred avenue they would like to see us explore in order to achieve a result, because they have some preference, and then go that path. And then we can get into this discussion of how should we fund those things and who does what and can we reuse research. I think we've quickly got perhaps to step 2, where step 1 is what did the FCC think of what we've done so far?
Well, so why don't we ask our designated federal officer, Tejas, both Marcus's question that I think has to do a lot with inputs, setting the agenda for the committee in the coming year, and doing so in part by reacting to what the committee has done so far, aware that the commission has an interim chairwoman right now. And second, perhaps thinking through the fact that there is something the commission has asked this committee to do in the order. One is monitoring certain things out in the world, and the other, I believe, is a request for a 2-year review of the mobile space and how it has evolved since the time of the order. And, of course, it took a year to stand up the committee after the order, so we're pretty much at the 2-year mark. So maybe if you've got thoughts to the extent you can share them on each of those, and it may just be limited in process to having this committee meet with either the current chairwoman or, once confirmed, a new chair in person or by telephone.
So certainly the folks that are at the FCC that focus on open internet related issues extend far beyond just me. So I think that what would be extremely useful is that the report is extremely detailed and is the result of a lot of work. But I think, as a few people mentioned earlier, it masks some of the particular opinions that individuals had. There are points that may have been dulled a bit, I think, to reach consensus, where you hide some of the particular conflicting perspectives that come out. So one thing that would certainly be useful is not only to deliver the report when it finally comes out in print or in paper form, but to also set up some time between members of the committee and the staff of the FCC that work on open internet related issues to talk through exactly each of the 4 areas and what the report says, and perhaps what issues seemed more difficult were ones that agreement was reached more easily. And I think that sort of perspective could be extremely helpful in addition to what is in the report. Of course, anything we do to that effect would have to be consistent with regulations as a FACA committee, and just make sure that everything we do is appropriate in that way. But I think that getting that perspective would be particularly useful. Looking ahead to the next year, I think I'd echo what Jonathan just said about the monitoring in particular, and I think that looking back across the presentations of each of the 4 working groups, that was a theme that came up. So I just made a few notes, and I think, Jennifer, your slide said that one of the things that might be useful is to track trends affecting competition. Specialized services, you spoke specifically about monitoring. Economic impacts of the same thing. So I think that in particular, what's great about the group of people here are that they're a lot closer, I think, to emerging trends than sometimes we can be at the FCC. So that sort of early warning system, really getting a sense of what's coming up and how things are changing, is extremely useful. So in that way, also the rapid response working group that you talked about could be particularly helpful. So these are just a few initial thoughts that I have on how the committee might be structured usefully going forward. But I think certainly a compendium of things that are changing as they change would be especially helpful.
That sounds great. I just want to. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to ask Henning if he had any further thoughts or things that he would want to add on.
I do want to reflect briefly, because I think Dave made a very valuable point that we struggle with for every advisory committee. Namely, what is the most effective mode of operation given the financial limitations that the Commission has in actually supporting that work, and recognizing, and this is often the case that different participants have different resources that they can avail themselves of because of their institutional affiliations that they have, both legally and practically. What I think has been, and I think a number of people have indirectly alluded to that, is where the work can often be most useful is in distilling, clarifying, and condensing diverse viewpoints into something that at least uses a common terminology. And I think the specialized services discussion was a good example of that, where I think all the participants came away, even if no original research was performed, with a better understanding of the complexity of a term, which in itself sounds relatively simple if nondescript. I don't think realistically, given, unless you, anybody else has a special relationship to Congress that can work on our budget issues, that we have research funding available that we could make available. Without speaking for anybody, I suspect we would all be happy if that were the case. And I've certainly in other environments made the case that the FCC would be in a much better position if we had the ability to do focused research, which differs pretty significantly from what NSF and DARPA and other entities could do and would fund in almost all circumstances. On a going forward basis, I do think beyond just kind of a generic monitoring one is the question is what are likely, what we worry about are, and I think Jennifer, you mentioned that early on, what are the kind of surprises that can occur? I've heard two very different comments, not here but elsewhere. Namely, one is a comment that we are done with surprises, right? And the surprises are in large scale, in the sense that we've converged, say, in the mobile space and to some extent also in the residential access space, to reasonably predictable set of technologies, hybrid fiber, something, and 4G, LTE advanced type of thing in the mobile space, plus unlicensed, obviously, as a supplement. But are there things that could surprise us in the sense that I don't think, Jennifer, you would have been particularly surprised by the emergence of programmable computing devices in the mobile space. And I suspect this is true for many of us here, that what might be surprising to kind of the general interest, general public community may not necessarily be altogether completely surprising to members of the committee, even if it's not always formulated. So one of the things that I'm hoping for, among many other possibilities, is to see what are possible trajectories that have at least, a plausible technical, economic, and policy way of getting there in the next 5 years. I say that's the kind of typical time horizon. I think beyond it gets to be really hard in that. And what are the impacts on the goals of the open internet order as well as the broader internet ecosystem? Is it true, is stability, relatively speaking, with mostly economic dislocations, if you like, or are there radical new technologies that are likely to be either in the lab or in otherwise visible to members of the committee that could, in combination or by themselves, shake up the ecosystem as much as, say, DOCSIS did or as much as iOS and Android did a few years ago, but now obviously a fair number of years ago. So that would be my general comment is, can we essentially, without being able to do detailed market research, can we use your collective expertise to help us not be too surprised? And I think that's particularly important for the Commission right now in its transition phase with a new leadership and another new leadership in the wings, so to say. Does it make sense, Tedros?
It may also suggest, as we reflect on how to best integrate public comment and participation, if what we're looking for are potential surprises, to see if there are ways to solicit ideas from the public and use the committee resources to help sift and winnow and weigh in upon, rather than just looking to the committee for those surprises. And on the more pedestrian monitoring that the order calls for this committee to do. I just want to note it still leaves open the resource question on that front, both just who's literally going to be filling out the spreadsheets that those monitoring may ultimately boil down to, and where will the sources of the data that's being monitored come from, with what level of cooperation or offering up. That's just, I think, something we'll have to keep an eye on. Now, speaking of public participation, we're within our public comment period, so what I'd like to suggest we do is continue our conversation on our agenda, both process and substance, but also invite anybody who wants to weigh in. There's a microphone centered in the room. Feel free to join our conversation as we go on if you are so moved with a public comment. And while we wait as people consider whether they have such a thing, the floor remains open for fellow members of the committee. Shane.
Yeah, I'll just make one remark. At the intersection of the remark about anticipating surprises and the other topic that's also come up, composition of the committee. I guess, in my pedagogical role as a professor for my students, and when I am trying to forecast the direction the Internet's going to take, I will admit that we've already identified the absence of Apple and Google from the committee as something that's interesting. I would say it's actually rather difficult to have a conversation about the future of the Internet without either of those two firms in the room. I would also just go even more forward and say Amazon and Facebook, at least in the moment, and arguably eBay and Yahoo, because I've just mentioned all the largest firms in the United States. And so just, and then we have representation from some other firms that one would also want to have in the room, such as Netflix and Mozilla and so on.
And another thought then would also be potentially just thinking about, say, if we go on the road again to Silicon Valley, structuring a day where we're actually engaging with companies large and small and other institutions to at least weigh in on that basis. Other comments?
Yep. Of course, agree with that comment, but I want to come back to Henning's, and it's related to my comment. I think, to some extent, the mobile broadband group, we actually did do a preview of what we see coming in the next 5 years, and at least that's a good starting point for the FCC to give a response to that, to say, okay, based on what you've outlined and the tensions you see between those players, give us some guidance to say which of those is most interesting that we explore further, and maybe even then apply monitoring to that in some quantitative or non-quantitative way. I worry, again, that we're being asked to do work because we exist, and we're thoughtful individuals and an interesting group, but not work without a purpose beyond that. And so I would like to see sort of some official feedback, particularly on the comments made, and particularly I think that's around the mobile broadband group, the idea of a label, the idea of monitoring for specialized services, and some direction given before we go any further. Otherwise, I fear we just exist because we exist.
Should also, I'll look, and with Tejas' help, check out our particular statutory charter from FACA. I think there are actions we can take that actually formally prompt a request for a reply from the Commission. At the moment, I think we're doing an encouraging soft ask for a reaction, but there are things we can do, right?
I think certainly we can do that.
Very good. Dennis.
Yeah, and I think this was following the same track. In fact, I was pleased that Marcus jumped in where he did, because I had my card up to have almost exactly the same inputs. It was very positive. But speaking to this point, and with experience on other FCC groups, it is very common for the FCC to help considerably with the agenda, working with the chair, or chair and co-chair in this case, so that we have considerable guidance on what would be the matters that would be most valuable to take up the next time around. So I think that is something that if we could click in, that would be very, very helpful to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yep, John.
So I'll just, I guess, if it's not seconding, it must be thirding.
Now choir.
The sort of desire for direction, and I think it might be useful just to specifically emphasize the formal, although perhaps prosaic, area of monitoring. Certainly, I understand as a researcher the desire to anticipate surprises, but as an engineer, I like to work on things that are based on facts. And certainly, representing AT&T, it's a more comfortable place to operate when work that is essentially targeted at a regulatory body is not based on opinion, speculation, or hypotheticals, but is based on real activities that are occurring in the marketplace. And therefore, a specific area for feedback would be what monitoring is desired. Because, again, I think there have been, at least from my perspective, and my perspective may be a little bit biased, precious few harms that have been identified in a year's worth of work. Certainly, the FCC has a charter and a mandate, not just for the next year, but on into the future, to monitor the health of the Internet. And what specifically would benefit their mission and their charter if we monitored it? Because that would then focus the group to address those specific questions rather than having us attempt to make up things to work on for the next year.
Dennis again?
I guess there is one other area that we might consider forming a group or making it the major subtitle for one of the groups, and that would be to actually go back and examine the order with an eye to the things that might be added to the order to make it more useful as we look forward. It was part of our charter, and we really have spent very little time on that topic, so perhaps making that a focus area would be a valuable thing for us to do in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Please step to the mic.
So, Chuck, you talked a little
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, I'm a law student at Harvard. My name is David Curtis. I did some work with professors at Trin for some of the prior meetings of OIAC. You've talked a little bit about the unidentified or unproven harms that result from the Internet in its current unregulated state. And I was wondering specifically in the specialized services context if your sense is that the benefits of allowing AT&T, for instance, to allow for specialized services as a means to increase your ability to fund further network development and sort of indirectly benefit the consumer is the only way in which there's I guess the question is, do you see that as the solution in the specialized services context to this dirt road future of the information superhighway, or is there more of a general skepticism on your part that there's any problem that the FCC needs to be addressing?
So the question was addressed to me, but it was also about specialized services, so Dave or other members of that group can chime in. I think the report does discuss in the specialized services area is one where there are some interesting and thorny questions. So I don't want to diminish the nature of the questions that the committee has been struggling with for the last year. Certainly it's my belief, and I don't, I can tell you, and I said this to the other members of the group. I did not contribute to or and have not seen the business case for AT&T's UVerse service, for example. But it is my belief that the investment that was made in rolling out that augmentation to our broadband infrastructure was strongly supported by the services that complemented the high-speed internet access service, the UVerse video service and the VoIP services, because, and it's just logical, someone who's an economist could speak to it probably better than I, that if you have a number of services that are supporting the investment, all of those services are going to benefit in some way, and it's going to be easier to make a business case work to fund that fairly significant and substantial capital investment that infrastructure providers have to make. So there is clearly, at least in my opinion, a benefit from the specialized services. And my comment about harms is simply that, not that there isn't a potential, but that it would be, in my opinion, foolish to impose significant regulatory burdens until or unless real harms are demonstrated. And so monitoring is clearly something that is needed, and that is in fact likely to be one of the areas that the Specialized Services Group will work on over the course of the next year, to actually try to describe, define, quantify what sort of monitoring may be appropriate. But until or unless actual harms are demonstrated, it seems to make sense to encourage infrastructure providers to innovate in the same way that we, in fact, as infrastructure providers, want to encourage application providers to innovate. I'll make a comment now that I didn't make earlier when David talked about the digital dirt road. There is this, I guess, fear that specialized services could be used by infrastructure providers in such a way as to relegate the internet service to a dirt road, to a backwater. And the analogy, or rather a fractured metaphor that I was going to use when David said that earlier, is that I think that the digital dirt road went the way of the walled garden. It's a pretty fractured metaphor, but I think we all learned a number of years ago, we infrastructure service providers, that there is no way that any infrastructure service provider is going to compete with the application innovation that's going on out there. Our job is to enable it. And we actually, in a number of different ways, and I'm not going to make this a commercial for AT&T, are actively working to encourage that innovation because we benefit from it. The consumers benefit from it, we benefit from it, and the industry as a whole benefits from it. So I personally, again, sitting from where I sit, do not see the digital dirt road as a likely consequence of specialized services, because we compete on the basis of the quality of our internet service, just along with all of the other services we offer. So it's good to encourage them. It's good to monitor what the effect of those services are on the broadband internet access service, and it would, I think, be remiss of the Commission to impose any real regulatory burdens on specialized services until or unless there are real harms that are demonstrated from them. And so that's really the point that I was trying to make.
I'll add a couple of things in. One, because I have a modeling team that looks across sort of independent of AT&T's business case or Verizon's business case or Comcast, what the fundamentals are of building networks. And one thing that is obviously true is that more operators typically invest a fixed percentage of revenue in the network infrastructure and the OPEX. So the more revenue they make, the more they invest. And that is, it varies between 18 to 20%, but it's in that range, right? And it's always in that range, more or less independent of the absolute amount of revenue. So there's an argument there. Secondly, there's an obvious correlation if you look at the financials of most operators, that the wireline side of the network, the one where we're talking about specialized services, is actually what funds the wireless network. You can't actually independently build those two networks because the revenue from wireline is currently advance funding wireless, because wireless is still relatively an unprofitable network because of the need to build in advance of the revenue appearing. So that's another factor that says wireline and wireless are coupled. And last, I would say the inverse of that is if you look in Europe, back to Alyssa's point, hyper-competition driven, whether it's by regulation or market forces, has resulted in average revenue per user that is approaching zero, and in some cases is zero, which has led to underinvestment in both the wireline and wireless networks. And partly it's also driven by the absence of video revenue because it's free over-the-air video there. So those combination of factors have led to an underinvestment that no one benefits from. So I think there's a positive correlation with revenue, and there's the anti-correlation that in the absence of new revenue, you actually destroy markets. That says that there is substantial evidence that what you asserted is the case, or might be the case, is in fact the case. The question is whether there's a happier medium that we can strike, not whether more revenue is a good thing. I think it is a good thing for network builds and the virtuous cycle that Jen highlighted. The only question is whether there's a medium that we haven't struck yet that is the right point between, say, those two extremes.
I guess my fear would be that if you look at something like EVE Online, if that becomes more of the norm, you end up with more resources being devoted specifically to specialized services. You're talking about a specific percentage that's being devoted to internet service right now. But I can sort of look down the road and see the possibility of more resources being thrown only towards specialized services if there is seen to be more profit coming out of that than from consumers, and specifically in internet context.
Right, but what you have to, I think, understand is that a specialized service is a network build. And the only question is, and we've highlighted this, is whether a disproportionate and excessive amount of bandwidth is in that network build is attributed to just that service, and there is no benefit derived by the broadband portion, the internet portion. And to Chuck's point, we've never found that to be the case because, in fact, as I think Kevin repeated, he says broadband internet service is a good business to be in, and meaning it's a profitable business that makes a healthy return. And diminishing the value of that business in favor of a video business is actually a bizarre thing to do, is because content rights say that the profitability of a video, buying content rights says the profitability of delivering a video service is perhaps not as good as you would think it is relative to a broadband internet service. So those two actually are slightly inverted in terms of the incentive. So the incentive would be to invest in the internet business more than the video business. Just so happens the video business helps pay the bills.
Brad, you wanted to say something before?
So in trying to think about that relationship, in some ways you can sort of reflect back on the experience that we all went through in the way the PC marketplace evolved and the PC operating system marketplace evolved. And obviously early on, Microsoft, who was the dominant operating system provider, had a huge incentive to encourage innovation on top of that operating system, and was very open about it, and had big development investments in outside developers and things. And over time, as the operating system became more dominant, there's at least some outside observers would argue that they begin to internalize some of the value that had been created on top of that platform. And I think that's the nagging concern that people who invest in the applications layer have about this relationship between the interface between the applications and the underlying network, the infrastructure that's being provided. So I think trying to figure out how to encourage innovation and investment in the network and encourage innovation and investment on the network is the central problem. And the one argument I've heard here is that investment in the network is actually subsidized by profits achieved with services being provided on the network, and therefore everyone benefits. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, because you have two different kinds of investment. If you're investing in, as an example, an open access infrastructure network, then you have a different kind of asset than if you're investing in an application, for instance. An application is going to be more speculative. It perhaps has a higher upside, but a riskier downside about whether or not it's going to be successful. If you're investing in, as an example, putting fiber in the ground, that asset is going to have value over time, no matter what. And you have a different kind of investor who's willing to back that, and a different return profile. When you mix the two together, you actually are mixing the two investors together, and that may actually reduce the profitability of the build, because you're not getting the advantage of the underlying infrastructure investor and the investment profile of that when you mix the two together. So it's a complicated story.
In the time we have left, I'd love to ask again if there are thoughts on procedures or topics for next year, including the working group configurations. Are there particular working groups that people want to propose, or amendments to our current structure that people might have in mind? And the floor also remains open for further public comment.
I have a subject I'd like to bring up. I don't know whether it quite gets to the point of needing a working group, but something that's kind of the base of a lot of these discussions has to do with over-provision, where Kevin talked about the 7 elements of the network. One of the things I haven't been able to find and haven't really seen good data is some kind of a statistical analysis of typical over-provisioning of the different parts of the network. That's something that I have started doing within my own network and have come to some really interesting conclusions. I brought it up at a BITAG meeting, and it's kind of like it seemed like I had shined light on the mold behind a refrigerator or something, because nobody wanted to really provide any internal information about it. And I think that's really the crux of a lot of this. There's, we've seen, I've heard quotes about the availability of 100 meg internet to this high percentage of the population. What percentage of the population actually can purchase this internet? And is the price even at a point that people would want to buy it? I know where I'm at, a 50 meg connection of a specialized service type that's provisioned at 1-to-1 that I'm guaranteed I'm going to get my 50 meg costs me about $1,700 a month. But I can buy a 50 meg connection from a fiber provider for $50 a month. The difference between those two has to do with over-provision. And I don't think I've seen any real attention given to that subject. And I think it's because service providers don't really want to talk about it. I keep hearing it, that's the special sauce. Charles is talking about AT&T's network, being willing to back up the fact that their network is good at all these things. I'd be really interested to see what their provisioning numbers look like as far as over-provisioning on the network, that sort of thing. I think that's a critical point that is really at the base of a lot of the open internet discussion.
I don't know whether we want to have a technical conversation now or just ask where we could lodge that question. But I was going to, as somebody who's not a carrier, my impression is that certainly in Europe, the regulators have actually been talking about getting the providers to talk about their statistical factors, like how many, what kind of statistical gain are you trying to put in it. I think a lot of the carriers in this country have taken a rather pragmatic view, which is they try to make sure that the links aren't running congested. And if a link is running congested, you engineer your way out of the space, as opposed to saying, well, I engineer 20-to-1 or 10-to-1 or 5-to-1 or something like that. So that, to Kevin's point, I think there's a very interesting research question here, which is when you see congestion, where is it and why? But I would sort of come at it from the other end, which is to say, where is the congestion coming from? Because that suggests that that's a place where the provisioning is becoming the point of. There's always going to be congestion someplace, right? Unless the application simply, like video, doesn't go as fast as you want. But so, I think it's hard to talk about because people don't want to answer a question that, in fact, operationally they don't answer. Which is what, I engineer 20 to 1 or something like that. So the answer is no. How hot do we run our links is another way to ask the question, right? Which has nothing to do with an over-provisioning factor. I don't know whether this is something the FCC should be monitoring. My personal view is that we shouldn't be asking people to talk about their provisioning ratios. What we should be looking for is where in the network is the congestion occurring.
Yeah.
And that then can lead to some conversations about whether this is due to business practice or underinvestment or strategic behavior or whatever. But
Yeah, I would add to that. There's a lot of differences in geographies. So the over-provisioning rate of Portland is going to be very different than the over-provisioning rate of New Jersey. And you're right, David. Is there is a factor of you build ahead of demand, and you continually drive your networks to stay ahead of demand. And I think one of the measurements and monitoring that goes on today is measuring Broadband America and says what percentage of the consumers are receiving 100% of their advertised speed. And there's lots of data which talks about that. It doesn't answer the end-to-end question, which again has multiple parties involved in the end-to-end performance. But what it does do is measure that if you are getting 30 meg service, if you're getting 50 meg service, are you actually receiving 30 meg service or 50 meg service?
One of the topics I'd like to come back to Brad's point is in and on the internet. And Jen, I think we alluded to this, software-defined networking says that in and on now have a relationship, which they didn't before. In and on now become tied together in a way that is transparent, and there will be an API that you can use for on to access in. And I think that will be an interesting area, specific topic to say, and since we have a resident expert here in Jen, who has been so industrious in running the mobile broadband group, it would be interesting to take that as a question specifically, is as we open networks and connect on to in a new way using software-defined networks and open interfaces, is there a greater potential for there to be a coupled good as opposed to a one taking advantage over the other? And I think that would be a specific one that is a very open question, but Jen is a particularly good person to lead it, and lots of people here would have an interest in exploring, I think, as a new topic. But I don't know if others agree.
I do think it's an interesting topic. Just real quickly on that, in the sort of in the application space, there's a lot of examples of applications providers who provide APIs and encourage investment on top of those APIs. The test to define whether or not that API is open is usually, are they building their own services on top of the same API that they're making available to others, and are there special hooks that they're not making available to others? If we're talking about a software-defined network where there's a defined API and all of the services are available to all of the value adders on top of that network on the same terms that the underlying network provider uses those same hooks, that's great. That's really good for everybody.
On additional topics, I just wanted to throw two more into the potential mix. One is on ad hoc networks for public safety, something that, wearing another hat, I've been thinking about. I've talked to Henning about it at some length, and it might be of interest, ways in which both Wi-Fi offloading or device-to-device direct communication can be helpful when traditional current means of communication are down. And another thought might be, and I'm mindful...
Could you say just a little bit more about that?
Sure. I recently wrote an op-ed with Julius Janikowski in his personal capacity just after he stepped down as chairman on in times of natural disaster or attack or some other way in which the usual means of getting online may happen to be down, looking first modestly for those who still have broadband and happen to have Wi-Fi access points that they have secured against public access, ways to facilitate them throwing a switch so that they become momentarily in the business of providing Wi-Fi to those who are nearby, even if they're not normally in that business, or even closed access points, removing the speed bump of having to register and pay for the duration of the local crisis. And the more ambitious proposal would be thinking about potentially a message-based, not packet-based network by which brief messages could be conveyed within an ever-changing ad hoc set of points of presence, to be able, possibly even with cached credentials from services like Facebook or Twitter, to say, I can't get to Twitter.com, I can't get to Facebook.com, but can I find out if anybody within this phone-to-phone network is a Facebook friend or a Twitter follower or someone I'd follow on Twitter? That could be extremely useful within that zone, that physical zone, to get out a message that says, I'm okay, or this is where I am, or I need a blanket, something like that. And that strikes me as something of potentially great interest. Whether or not the committee is the right place for it, I'm not as sure. A second idea would be thinking of Chuck Slocum's participation on the committee too. 6 strikes. How is that going? How has that implementation unfolded? How many people are being touched by it? What impact is that having on the world? I don't know who's looking at that, but that could potentially be something our committee would take up to see about that. I see Craig Newman at the mic. Craig, welcome.
My name is Craig Newman. I'm a partner with Richards, Kibbe & Orby, which is a New York-based law firm. I also serve as CEO of the Freedom to Connect Foundation, which is a nonprofit. We track internet-based censorship in non-U.S. countries, internet-based censorship regulation. And we also fund open source technology projects outside of the United States to deal with internet censorship. And under the kind of category of things to look at, things to consider for your next term, I note that your charter authorizes you to look at market developments regarding freedom and openness on the internet. And the idea, I think that a couple people have floated, I think, Alyssa, you talked a little bit about it under the category of innovation, and that is all of the restrictions outside of the United States on internet access, internet freedoms, even in some of the traditionally democratic countries. You look what's going on in Singapore right now and all the internet regulations there, and it has a huge impact on internet users in the United States. And this is an area that I think more from a comparative perspective than anything else might be a good topic to consider next year. I realize that politically and diplomatically it's a bit of an oil slick, but I think from a comparative perspective it's something that might be worth your time.
Did you say that it has a large impact on users in the United States?
Absolutely. If you were to try to communicate with internet users where, websites are either blocked, you want to do a Facebook posting, things like that. If you're in Saudi Arabia, you're not going to see that. I mean, you saw, I think 2 or 3 days ago, Freedom House issued a report talking about people, I think 6 or 7 people in Saudi Arabia have been marched off to prison because of Facebook postings. So there's a question of access to information. And that doesn't even start addressing the questions of in places like North Korea where you essentially don't have an internet or you don't have any access to an internet.
Just while we're collecting ideas, one more that kind of came up in the mobile group, and we never really got to it, but has relevance for other groups as well, is WebRTC and kind of what the world might look like with further development of WebRTC. Could be a good topic for us in this. It's not quite, early warning because people kind of know that it's coming, but I think this group might have some helpful thoughts and be able to leverage some resources that the FCC might not otherwise be aware of. So.
Any other thoughts, comments? David, anything else you want to say?
Well, I think that the final comment should go back to some of the comments from the various committee members. We should not consider ourselves to be entirely driven by what the FCC wants us to do, but at the same time, signals of interest from the FCC, to me, are critical in justifying why we are doing this work under the imprimatur of the agency. And it may very well be that because of the period of transition now, that this is a hard thing for them to answer over the summer, but it may very well be we need basically to engage them once a new chair has been appointed and negotiate about what they are interested in, where we think we would like to exercise our autonomy. But it's possible that that's a conversation that really needs to wait for the fall when we have a new chairman in place. And so I think realistically the timing may say that the summer is the wrong time to press for that, so we need to discuss what to do over the summer. Maybe we should take a vacation.
That's a proposal that there may not be extensive debate about, unlike almost everything else. Well, I think that's fair to say that both David and I hear loud and clear and share the sense that we've all put a lot of work into this, a lot of work, among people that have full plates. And we want it to have an impact. We want it to matter. We want to move the ball forward. And we will be talking to the staff at the commission about how to make that impact happen and how to build that not only into our agenda, the topics we take up in our working groups, but also how to structure our plenary meetings where we really are burning carbon and other resources to come together to make that as useful as possible. So completely agree with that. And again, just want to thank the full committee for all of the efforts that it and its working group chairs have put in to generate what I think will be, despite some of the questions we have going forward, an extremely useful and informative and substantive set of ideas in the document that we will be releasing. So let me ask Tejas, whom I also thank, if there's anything else we should be doing before we adjourn ourselves.
No, I mean, I think that we certainly hear the message of the group, and Henning and I, and together with the chairs, we'll think, I think, clearly about what could be useful, and then work with the individual groups to sort of work within the membership and the restraints of the group to also come to, I think, a clear agenda for each of the working groups going forward. And once again, even hearing that message, I just want to emphasize that the report and the work of the group over the course of the last year has been incredibly useful, and I think hearing the various points of views on each of these interesting topics has been really interesting and enlightening. So thank you all.
So we'll be thinking through the timetable of our future meetings and reaching out to the members to see what will work. If we go on the road, we may do the next one on the road, especially if there isn't likely to be a new chair in place by then. But my thought is that we should meet again in Washington at the FCC, if not the next meeting, the one after, and try to perhaps time it both to do the kinds of meetings, Tejas, you were talking about, where the working groups would be meeting with the corresponding FCC staff that might want to be hearing more directly and sharing things more directly with the working groups. And I think we should also seek to meet with the new chair of the commission once that's up and running, or potentially see if there's something we want to put in front of the full commission when it meets. So with that, again, thanks to everyone for your efforts this year, and onward to the next year. We stand adjourned.